Board meeting in Brattleboro, Vermont. It's May 20th. Unfortunately, the Brattleboro Union High School was not able to provide a flag this morning, so we'll dispense with the Pledge of Allegiance. And as you all know, that does not disturb me too much at all. But I'd like to call on Ron Staley, the superintendent of Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union, for a few minutes.
Well, I just want to thank you for coming down to Brattleboro. We really appreciate you coming here for the state board meeting. I'm sorry. We really appreciate you coming down to Brattleboro. I think it was a couple of falls ago that in October you were here, and just appreciate the fact that you have the South on the radar, and we know Lachlan Francis is instrumental in coercing the group down here to the South, and we really appreciate that. So hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you a little bit more later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Lachlan, you have a few things you'd like to say.
Yeah, so I suppose welcome to Brattleboro Union High School. I'm glad most all of us could make it down here and find parking and find the room and all that. That's always a good start. So yeah, it should be, it's nice to have you guys at my soon-to-be alma mater, I suppose. We've got the purple and white tablecloths and everything. But yeah, I think as I come to the end of my time on the state board and having, I guess, one more month, it's been a tremendous honor to work with all you guys. I feel like we've accomplished a fair bit, and it's a lot, really, with especially the EQS and all the other work that we're going on, and we've got more great stuff on the agenda today, especially around balanced accountability and standardized testing. So I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, I'd like to thank you guys for the support you guys have helped me with in the last 2 years or so, and especially Stephen for the rides and really becoming a role model over the last 2 years. So.
And driving, I mean.
Well, more than driving, but that too.
Well, as you know, we will be celebrating Lachlan's service at our next board meeting, but in that we're in his hometown, I feel compelled to say a few words. As you all know, Vermont has kind of led the nation with student participation in state boards of education. And I think over the years, at least in my tenure, we've been very honored to have some very dedicated, caring students. We've had several qualified students that have been appointed by various governors. But in my opinion, no student has distinguished himself more than Lachlan. Very ably represented the student positions during his tenure, but more importantly, had a very good perspective on broader educational policy. And as you all know, that for the first time, a student member rose to a leadership position on this board, and Lachlan was elected as co-chair, and that is the first time a student has been in a leadership position. Lachlan, you've been a great State Board of Education member. We're going to miss you. And BUH should be proud to have fostered a great student and created a leader. And I'm confident that we will hear more of Lachlan in the future. So I want to thank you for your service, Lachlan, and we'll have a lot more to say next month, but I wanted to make sure that you were acknowledged in front of within your institution here.
Thank you.
Carol?
From a historical perspective, I just wanted to let you know that actually the first student on the state board was from Brattleboro High School. Nice. His name was Isaac Evans France, and he in 2000 was instrumental in getting the legislation passed. So here we are back, and another outstanding student from Brattleboro.
So I should always appoint people from Wyndham County every other year.
Well, Carol, I think it's unfortunate you brought that up because Lachlan was not able to get our legislation passed this year. So, Lachlan, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to work with. I look forward to my trips to Montpelier in the future, where I won't land in town quite so exhausted after dealing with you for 2 hours. Let's go back to Ron Staley. You have a few things you would like to comment on?
Yeah, I had the good fortune of meeting Lachlan as an 8th grader when we did middle school leadership training. And Lachlan was one of our first students working on asset development. And what's evolved is, as he's become a high school student, he's worked with other high schoolers on one of our collegiate high school classes, a dual credit class called Social Dimensions for Social Change. And what that does is Lachlan and other high school students work with middle school and upper elementary school students on social competency and climate issues within the schools. And he has been an outstanding role model for the younger kids and for me. He has just been a great asset to this whole institution. So we're going to miss you, and we'll enjoy our last few weeks together.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to item B, members of the public to be heard. Not seeing any, we will move on to announcements from board members. Any board members have an announcement they'd like to make?
Yes. Earlier in May, on May 9th, there was the 14th Annual Learning in Place Conference in Barnet, and Rebecca was able to attend and did a fabulous job of talking to the students, and we very much enjoyed having her at that conference. So I'm going to pass around the information flyer so you can see the event and her contribution to it. Thank you, Rebecca, for coming. Made a big difference.
Other members of the board, Bill?
I was on a NASB conference call for the Governmental Affairs Committee, and if you think that Montpelier might be a little bit crazy in terms of politics, think Washington, and you'll get a new perspective. I could summarize the call by saying nothing is happening in front of an election, and the Ed Sciences Reform Act did pass with good bipartisan support, and that's good. Charter initiative passed the House, but did not pass the Senate in the last year. The budget is going to be slow and painful, and don't look for anything until after the election. The federal DOE is looking at some school climate competition. I don't know if that's anything you're interested in or not.
Yes, very much.
Rebecca's not a yes. And something we should maybe talk about at some point is whether the latest developments on waivers and where that's going. We're not a waiver state. I'm not desiring to be one, to tell you the truth, but it's something we should keep an eye on. Sean Marie, what's Brad's last name? Hull. He did a workshop for us 2 years ago, and he's now left the NASB. So that's it.
Are there other board announcements? If not, I cut Ron off a little too short, so Ron, you have a few other things you wanted to cover with us? I apologize.
I think I missed the sequence of things, but we just wanted to provide the board with a brief update on a couple of topics. One is the dual credit initiative that we've been involved with, and then I think we'd like to just give you a brief overview of the personal learning plan work that we're involved with. Just take one and pass it along. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
I need one. Oh,
Yeah.
thanks.
I'm sorry.
So, when we spoke to you last couple of years in October, we had probably been into our third year of developing the dual credit program at not only BUHS, but also the Wyndham Regional Career Center. And the thinking was to make it a regional program that our sending school students would be able to participate in. And so we started with about 5 courses. The next year it grew to 10. I think the last time we spoke to the state board, it was probably around 25 to 30 classes. As you can see now, there's 41. There's actually 42 because we just had Chinese language, advanced Chinese language approved by SIT, so there'll be 42 courses. You can see the college partners. It's a wide range of institutions that we partner with, VTC, CCV, the local schools like Marlborough College, SIT, Landmark College, a lot of the New Hampshire Community College programs. New Hampshire is kind of unique where their community colleges offer first-level college courses in every high school. At the high school, and that was a model that we kind of looked at when we were developing our coursework. We currently have 300 students enrolled in these courses. Our students receive between 15 and 30 credits, college credits, as they graduate from BUHS and the Career Center. If you look at the themes or the pathways, we've really tried to develop kind of a pathway approach. The first section, liberal studies, social justice. As I mentioned, Lachlan was involved with the dimensions of social change, number 8 on the list. That's been a really fantastic course where high school students are essentially mentoring and teaching middle school and upper elementary school students asset development work, climate issues. When we set this course up, we tried to get high school kids out of class to do these workshops, and it wouldn't work because principals like Steve Perrin had to deal with the teachers saying, well, how come these kids are out of class? So then we decided to make a class, and it's worked really well. You can see a business pathway, the STEM pathway. What's not on here yet will be the performing arts pathway, which is a new set of courses that are being developed. And I won't go through this whole document, but on the second page, it really highlights our guiding principles, allows students to have a smoother transition to college, demonstrates college readiness, raises the motivation and aspirations in our students, reduces remediation in college. Any study that you see about students having to take remedial courses in college, math and writing, they pay the same amount, they don't get the credit. I think 40 to 50% of the kids that need to take remedial courses drop out of school. And so we want to bypass that. Expanding school opportunities in the community. We have a lot of these courses linked with internships and partnerships within the community. And we have been steady with the idea of keeping a 3-credit course $100. The voucher system last year with the flexible pathway has helped an awful lot. We know that's a 2-year program, but even without that, we were committed to having the 3-credit course for $100. So over the course of 5 years, we've needed to develop a budget locally within the BUHS budget. And our board has been very supportive because they see the results. They see the number of kids that are taking these courses. So we're using the money for tuition reduction and scholarship money. Because even at $100 for a 3-credit course, which CCV would cost $650, UVM is $1,700, even at a low rate, some of the colleges and some of the courses require textbooks, and families aren't ready to spend $50 to $75 on a textbook, so we have scholarships available. So it's been a really good program. The next couple pages are the list of about 66 colleges that have accepted credit. When we first started this, people said, well, that's great, but will the colleges accept the credit? We have about 25 more colleges to add to this list, but students are reporting, we track this, that their colleges, when they attend college, are either accepting it as elective credit, or if it's tied to their major, they will give them credit for their major. So we've had really good results there. The other thing that I'm really proud about is the next couple pages. When we started with about 10 courses, we had 47% of our students were either first generation, meaning they are the first students in their family to attend college, or low-income students, low SES. And this chart shows that the most recent, last year tracking, 53% of our students are low-income or first-generation students. And that's the target population we're trying to hit. So we're really proud of that. The last chart shows the demographics in terms of race and ethnicity, and our collegiate high school enrollments, students of color, is about 14% compared to our general population of 11%. So again, we're making opportunities for kids that will really, I think, impact their lives. So we really do appreciate the legislation that went through with the flexible pathway. We are concerned that in our region, neighboring high schools, although they can send their students to the Career Center, we know the challenges for small high schools, that they need to hang on to their student population. So I think the concept of the flexible pathway was to allow all schools, all high schools, to implement this. And I don't know if that's being tracked, but my sense is that's not happening in a lot of high schools. And we would be very willing to offer workshops or a regional session on, ways to encourage this program to happen. I think in my mind, it really takes leadership in terms of the principals, and you get a couple of teachers that understand the value of dual credit. We started with a math course and a writing course and a Career Center course. And we had teachers that were kind of thinking, well, what's this all about? We talked with them, we brought them to the college partners, they were very excited about it, and we started with 5 courses. And you can see, people say, well, how many are you going to have? I don't know. But I think the important thing is our standards follow the college course standards. We have to have teachers that are willing to adjust their curriculum to the essential objectives of the college, and that's worked really well. We just had a workshop for our collegiate high school teachers with the library media specialist from Marlborough College did a workshop on research and writing, which we had about 16 teachers involved with that. It was awesome. So the connections with the colleges are really good, and the fact that our students are getting this benefit is very exciting to us. So I'd entertain questions if you have.
Stacy?
I'm just very impressed with the numbers of both the first generation and the lower SES students who are involved. So I was curious if you could talk a little bit about how you encourage those students to enroll, or what qualities enabled that sort of turnout to happen.
I think we were very intentional when we looked at the courses that we were trying to create for the dual credit. We didn't want to interfere with advanced placement courses. We have a number of those. We didn't want to interfere with some of the higher level courses that kids are going to naturally take, that are going to go on to 4-year colleges. But we looked at the number of courses that students kind of in the middle of the road would experience, would maybe take, and with encouragement, think about, this would be a good thing to pursue. So I think it was interest-based, and also thinking about these gateway courses, like a writing course and a basic math course, a college-level basic math course. And I think the fact that we have Career Center attached to the high school was a really great help. And then I think it's the encouragement of the teachers. I think a big element to the success of this is these classes are taught in the schools by their own teachers. They're essentially adjunct professors, if you will, for the colleges. And they have the people that they know that can encourage them and help them be successful. It's not to say that we do have a couple of courses where we send students to CCV or other schools. Landmark is a new partnership. And those teachers are great, but they don't have the same relationship with the students that their high school teachers have. So I don't know. I mean, it's pretty complex, but I think there's some key things in terms of our own teachers and the philosophy that we promote with this that I guess we start to realize it's going to impact those kids.
And follow up on that.
I think the other help is coming
Record,
from...
would you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm sorry. I'm Steve Perrin, principal of the high school. Hi. No relation, but, well, maybe back in the day.
Is it spelt the same way?
It is.
Oh, yeah.
Because
It is.
that's not too usual.
No.
There you go.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
Okay. So our school council has been a big part of this as well. And, you know, they've recognized kids from low SES and kids that are eager to improve themselves and eager to move on after high school. And they've done a great job of targeting students and having that conversation. We have a summer school program now that focuses on college and career readiness. And so we're hoping that those students, you know, we visit colleges during the summer, and we're hoping that that continues to help the program build as well.
The Paul Tuff in the New York Times Magazine on Sunday had a great story about why white students will often finish college and primarily students of color or low SCS drop out. And one of the main points was that those students will arrive in college and quickly get the message that they don't belong because they've been funneled into a remedial writing course or remedial math. And so it sounds like you really hit it on something where within this school where they're already known and feel comfortable, where they're identified as students with potential, not students who have failed. I'm wondering if you have any sense of how those students have done, students who have taken these classes moving forward.
They report to us, and again, our counselors track this, and that's where we get the list of colleges that our students report that they've earned credit and transferred the credit. You know, I guess it's too soon to think about, 5 years, 3 years ago, what the students have done, but anecdotally, we hear really great things when our counselors check in with the students. We're getting to a point where we're going to be seeing students graduate from college and report to us. And I think at that point, we're going to host some panel discussions with those students to talk to younger students. We're already, and we'll talk about this a little bit with the personal learning plan if we have time. VSAC has been a great partner with us and has been really helpful at the middle school level to think about career and college readiness. So, yeah, I mean, that whole concept of getting kids thinking, I can do this work, has been a key, so.
That's great, thank you.
One of the, I mean, we all know that finally the dual enrollment program is a statewide program, but I think where Brattleboro has distinguished itself is that by and large, 99% of the classes are held here on the campus, and as you say, mostly with your own teaching staff. And as some of us know, there's a major thing happening later this year, I guess, with an expansion of CCV and VTC in Brattleboro. How is this program going to fit in? And will this change that program at all, or?
I don't think so. It can enhance it. I mean, I would hope that the students will have opportunities, I mean, as they do now with CCV. It's pretty close to our campus, but right downtown Brattleboro will be even closer. So we would hope that there'll be a really good exchange between VTC and CCV and our students and teachers. So I think it can only help. What's interesting is, like with Landmark and Marlboro College, where they've been great partners in SIT, but SIT is more of a graduate school program, but with Marlboro and Landmark, so they have partnered with us, with our college, with our teachers here on campus, but they're offering courses the next semester on their campus. And they're providing a bus for our students, they're designing their course time tied to the high school schedule. So they're really being flexible, and that's going to get kids on a college campus because we want that to happen as well.
Great. Margaret?
Can you tell us a little bit more about the summer school, college and career readiness? How long that's been going, what the rate, how long it takes, what you do, and how it's funded?
Yeah, sure. Let me talk about the career and college readiness course. That's a career center class, which we've expanded. It was kind of like a remedial support course. But what's happened with this program is certain classes require the AccuPlacer assessment to be taken, and some kids are missing the standards to meet those cutoff scores. And so we redesigned that program to help students in that class get basic skills, related to reading and writing, and math. So that's been expanded during the school day. And so again, it's our own staff. It was a program that was funded anyway, and now it has a different focus. And we actually want to expand that more to the high school. The summer school is something that Steve and the Career Center Director really initiated, and I'll let Steve speak about that.
So we piloted it last year, and it's targeted at students who are entering ninth grade. And
Okay.
it's also targeted at students who are struggling in ninth grade. And so we have that 2-year cohort that we're working with, because we recognize that when students leave school, that decision's often made in middle school or earlier, and so we're trying to reverse that decision. It's a 5-week program. During the program, last year they did some robotics, they did some math, they did some English, and it runs from 8:30 to 1:30. We provide breakfast and lunch through our summer foods programs. And during the weeks, we visit local businesses to kind of see what offerings are here for students who want to graduate from high school and enter the workforce. We've gone to GS Precision, we went to the hospital, we went to ROV Technologies, which actually does nuclear power plant outages, and that was an amazing visit. And then we also visit colleges. We went to CCV, we went to UMass, went to Keene State. We tried to get a range. We wanted to get a community college, we wanted to get a big university, and we wanted to get a state school, and Keene's the closest one, and so we went there. It involves a tour. At UMass, we had lunch with the football team, and that was totally unplanned, but the kids were thrilled. And so we usually try to see if we can get somebody who's there in a summer program, whether it's athletics or an academic program, to come and visit. Keene has a brand-new design center, and with 3D printers and machining shops, and so we spent a day there. And so the kids, they literally walk on the campus and say, I could never imagine myself here. And then at the end of the day, on every trip, one student would say, I'm going to come here to college, whether it was UMass or CCV or Southern Vermont College. This year, we're hoping to do an overnight, and that's either going to be to Randolph, and from there, we'll go to VTC and then go north, or UVM, and stay overnight in Burlington and kind of explore those colleges. It's been a remarkable program, and we're excited to see it get bigger this year.
So how it's funded
Funded,
is,
yeah.
as I said, the Career and College Readiness course is within our program. I think the initial summer school was funded through some grants and monies that we had some flexibility through the Perkins grant
Okay.
with our Career Center. And then this year, it's, I think 10,000 was locally funded at BUHS and 10,000 in the Career Center.
Okay.
And again, we have some other grant money to supplement it, because these foundations understand the benefit of this type of early exploration for young students.
Yeah, and you're probably tracking the impact of this too on kids' decisions later on, when you get there, right?
Well, and not only that, we're also tracking, especially for those struggling ninth graders, how are they doing this year?
Yeah,
And, I'm happy, none of them have dropped out of school. They're all remaining in school. First semester, we had first semester data, they passed every one of their classes. And so, we're seeing a change, and we're seeing a definite shift in how they look at school.
Yeah.
Which is great to see.
thank you.
Mark?
Yeah, my question was on the budget line item for the dual enrollment. What is that? Does anybody know off the top
Yeah,
of their head?
it's $60,000.
Okay.
We started with, at that time, it was the Department of Ed innovation grants. I think we had 3 years of grant funding at about, I don't know, I think the total was $70,000 spread over 3 years. John Fisher was very instrumental in helping us acquire that. Armando was very supportive. And so that helped us with the first 3 years. And then I think locally, we just added like $10,000 initially, and then just incrementally increased it based on the fact that we have so many students taking it, the need for tuition reduction and scholarship. And again, I think the board has really seen the benefits, so it's out of a, what's our budget? It's a big budget. It's a big budget. $60,000 is a small percentage of a comprehensive budget, which includes the Career Center, high school and middle school.
Rebecca?
I just had two questions, and, well, really one is just an encouragement. It's really exciting to see the focus that you've had on encouraging first-generation kids and kids who are living in poverty to continue to go to college. We know that pretty consistently 25 or 30% of our kids go on to college anyway. And so the real challenge is moving deeper into the distribution and encouraging the kids who might not have gone to go there. So I hope you'll track this data really carefully moving forward, because what will be powerful to see is not only that they take these courses here, but they're actually going on and succeeding in post-secondary education in one way, shape, or form. And I think that's when we'll know Act 77 is successful, when we have that kind of data. So I'm thrilled to see this and hope you track it. And you all have spoken to another challenge, which is this issue of forming a college-going identity and helping students, all students, understand that they actually are college-going students or could be college-going students. And nationally, the literature on college courses offered on high school campuses taught by high school teachers is pretty mixed. And it doesn't seem to have the same effect as college courses taken on college campuses by college professors. In that it doesn't seem to generate the same sort of turnout at the college level. And I just wondered, you know, you're clearly doing some work here to help students, even the ones enrolled in your program here, develop that college-going identity. And I just wondered, how do you help students understand that a college course offered here by a high school teacher is really a college course? I mean, how have you framed that so students understand the difference?
Yeah, I think through orientations with the students, I think other students talking to students, I think students that have gone to college and received the credit, coming back and talking with students, just word of mouth. I think that's had a huge impact on the number of students that have decided to take courses. We have, I'll remember like about 4 years ago, we did an orientation after the students had signed up. I think half the kids didn't realize they were signed up for college-level courses. And some of them, you know, there were a couple courses where you had an option to take the college credit or not. And kids realized pretty quickly that, you know, you're doing the same work. The teachers at our school were saying, this is the level of work that you need to do. And, you know, you might have one less paper or a few other assignments that you didn't have to do. But the kids in the middle of the course, at the end, said, you know, I wish I had done it for college credit because I could have done that work. And it wasn't easy work, but it was work supported by teachers saying, these are ways that you can accomplish this. So I think things like that, word of mouth, people talking to other students, students coming back saying, yeah, I got 6 credits. And I got into a school because I had 9 credits that the college was very impressed with the fact that I had been able to do this work. So I agree with you. We still need to track further down into this in terms of when kids are completing college to get a real sense of the impact.
And just one last thought, I would encourage you to continue. I mean, one of the things I heard from a community college recently is they wanted to add remedial courses to their list of college-level offerings, and to me, that's not what this is about. If you need a remedial course at the college level, you should still be in your high school program because that's where you prepare yourself to develop the skills you need for college. So I really appreciate your saying that that hasn't been your focus, and I encourage you to really hold that bar.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it really demeans the whole purpose of this
Right.
initiative. So I want to commend you on that and encourage you to hold those standards.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments? Sean Marie?
I have a few questions in terms of, it's somewhat similar to what Rebecca was asking, but in terms of, I'm assuming on your first page list, the WRCC is your local career center.
Yes.
So is there anything that the teachers that are teaching these classes do differently than other teachers in terms of offering a college-level course?
They work with their college partners, and usually there's a instructor assigned to be kind of a mentor with our own teachers to work on changing our curriculum to meet the essential objectives of the college.
Who might a partner be?
Well, as you look at the list of colleges, so VTC, there'll be a math teacher from VTC that will work with our teacher doing math instruction. Marlborough College, there'll be an English teacher that's working with our English teacher.
So are they recognized by Marlborough and whatever these
Any of
other?
these schools, yeah, as adjunct instructors.
So
They have
if
to
you
meet
looked
their
at-
requirements.
So if you looked at their syllabus or you looked at their website, you'd see a Brattleboro teacher listed as somebody teaching a course at the high school?
I don't know that. I don't know if that's in their program of studies. I do know that our teachers have to fulfill their requirements that an adjunct instructor would have. And then, as I said, kind of modify their curriculum to meet the college standards.
So in terms of your internal scheduling, their schedule, anyone teaching these courses, it would mirror another teacher's schedule?
Yes, yeah.
And then, have you seen a drop in your AP classes in terms of enrollment?
No,
No?
No?
no, and we
They've
have a
held steady.
pretty robust list of AP, a
We
number
do.
of AP courses.
Yep.
And we don't see that they're competing against each other.
You know, we offer statistics as our collegiate high school offering, and we offer AP calculus, and we're really pleased to see enrollment in both of those courses continue to rise.
And what is the outcome of do all your students who take APs, are they required or expected to take the AP test?
They're expected to take the exam. And the results are mixed. I mean, some students do really well and some don't do as well.
I think we try to be really intentional when we introduce new courses to this program that will not compete with other courses. I mean, there's some cases you can't avoid it, but we've learned, like one of the English comp courses, maybe it shouldn't have been a collegiate high school course this year. And so we'll probably back off that because, you know, the idea of, you know, you can raise the standards, but if kids are not meeting that, then we're really not providing a basic high school course that these students need. So, you know, we tweak this.
And are they open to any 9th through 12th grader?
It's generally juniors and seniors, but we have had sophomores taken. I don't know that we've had any freshmen, but I know we've had some sophomores and do
Great.
really well.
Great, thank you.
How do the demographics of your AP offerings compare to the demographics of the students taking the college?
I don't know exactly, but I would say that the AP offerings are fewer first-generation students. That, you know, AP has a certain reputation and a certain, you know, cachet to it. And so people that go to AP courses are generally encouraged to go there because their parents have gone to college, so.
How do you manage that internally in terms of your college conversations?
The counselors have that conversation with kids, and they talk about the value of AP, and they also talk about the value of the collegiate high school courses. You know, with AP, you may or may not get college credit, depending on, you know, how you do in the exam and, you know, all of that. Whereas if you successfully complete the collegiate course, you're gonna get that credit. And that's a huge.
Not every college recognizes the credit, though.
Right, that's true, right.
Although it's impressive, the number of colleges on this list that do
That
recognize
do,
it.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're working
Any other
with the ones that
questions on
don't.
this subject? I just want to make note of, Ron, something you said that I'm concerned about is that, and this was a comment you made about the Career Center, that not all local regional high schools are fully supportive. I'm not quoting you now, but
Yeah, thanks.
are not fully supporting career centers because, as we know, that, you know, it's tuition-driven.
Yeah.
That a local high school wants to make sure that student is staying as much as possible at that high school and not jeopardizing tuition by coming to the career center. I think that's a flaw in our system.
And we've talked a lot with John Fisher, and he's very supportive. We would consider being a pilot that we change the ratio and leave more of the money in the sending school. Because I was a former high school principal at Leland and Gray up the road, small high school.
I know it well.
You do?
As a graduate.
Yes, good. Glad I didn't have to track, never mind.
That would have been easy.
Yeah. So I understand that, you know, when they used to be able to send 25, 30 students with a higher enrollment, now 15 to 20 is a challenge for them. And I would be willing, we have been willing to say, let's change the ratio of the numbers, keep more of the money in their district. The numbers of students that come to us, it's a benefit, but it's not about, I don't think for us in our district, it's not about, well, if we get these numbers of students, it's going to build our budget. It's not about that. It's about opportunities for kids.
Right.
And I think that's where that legislation, the school governance legislation, I mean, it's all about options for kids. It's not about, you know, superintendents or anything like that. So, you know, we'll be working with John Fisher to try to see if we can come up with some.
I would encourage that because it's I mean, obviously, you run a great program here, and if students in the area can't take full advantage of it, it's really, in my mind, contrary to the philosophy of creating the career centers.
Yeah.
Did you have another subject you
Well,
wanted?
we were just going to touch briefly on the personal learning plans.
Please.
Steve has led a work group that is starting to look at this and come up with some really exciting options. We also have a regional counselors group that has just started to meet again to think about what all of the other high schools are doing, so we can learn from each other. So Steve has a little.
Sure. So, we've spent some time for years looking at students that have 504 plans or IEP plans or some EST plan, and we've thought to ourselves, wouldn't it make sense that every student has a plan? And so, we're kind of glad to see Act 77, which kind of says that every student gets a plan, which is a great step. So, as that legislation passed, we looked at that and we thought about, we know we have 2 years to begin that, but we wanted to start next year with ninth graders. And so we're going to jump in and have our ninth graders start next year with PLPs. During that year, we're going to pilot our template with our ninth graders. We're also at the same time going to see if we can put that completely online so we don't have to track all that paper again. And part of the mission for this summer and next fall is to kind of build the public awareness and build the public will, and to really look at educating our school board, look at educating our parents about why we want to do a PLP and what the benefit is. We've had some great assistance because the agency sponsored grants to support the development of those plans, and we're the recipient of one of those grants. And so we've used that to form a K-12 group that's looking at how are we going to handle grades 7 through 12 students with personal learning plans. So we want to start when a student comes from, whether it's Dummerston, Putney, or BAMS, our middle school, that they can come in and we can look at that plan and have the plan have a lot in common. We know the language has to change as the students' developmental needs change, but we also want to make sure that we're kind of having a plan that's consistent when they come up. So we're committed as a district to have a common template. We want to have a 7-12 template. We've had a lot of experience having student information systems that don't match, and so we want to make sure this matches just to help ourselves. We know we want it to be online. VSAC has been doing some great work developing their own template. Where we're struggling a little bit is we want to move eventually to a proficiency-based graduation model. And a lot of the templates we see require English, social studies, math to be checked off and recorded. We actually want to do it where we're going to develop the proficiencies that a student needs to leave high school, and we want to have our plan go in that direction, which on the surface seems simple, but it's a pretty big undertaking because we'll have to go through all of our courses and say, where do each course meet a proficiency, and how does a student document that? So, that I think is going to take a 3 to 5 year rollout to really get that system fully functional, but that's kind of where we're looking to go. As part of our accreditation process, we developed learning expectations for all kids that we follow now. PLP is going to actually help us move that process along and make explicit connections between those expectations, our core values, and what students need to do to graduate. So we're hoping in the future that's where we're going to head. But for this fall, we're looking at ninth graders. We're hoping that some of our 7th grade partners will also pilot with their 7th graders so we can get a sense of where this is going to go. And the regional counselors meeting has helped a great deal because, again, going back to the Career Center, if all of our schools have a similar template, that's going to make things easier for our Career Center as well. So.
Well, terrific. That whole philosophy has a lot of support on this board as well as the agency, and so please keep us up to date.
Sure.
Any questions on that?
Can I just take 30 seconds?
Sure.
I also want to applaud the agency for their work on the balanced accountability model. Chris Case came down earlier this month and met with our leadership team and about 10 other people from outside districts, and it was really exciting to see the philosophy of getting away from just standardized tests. And I know, I value being in Vermont because we're not like a lot of states that are just driven by the tests. And I know it's a big challenge. I know the issue of capacity is going to be a big issue, but I really applaud Rebecca and the agency and the support of the state board for this balanced model. So really encourage us to keep thinking that way.
Appreciate
If
it.
we could only change the federal legislation.
Well, we can show a model that works.
Yeah. Margaret?
It's about the proficiency model.
Sure.
You're doing that work independently here and going through that. There are other schools in Vermont also doing that work. Do you see the potential for a network or what help could the state give in that effort? I know in New Hampshire, for example, it's a requirement that schools move to competency-based. I'm not suggesting that, but I'm wondering if there's network potential for
One of the great things has been the League of Innovative Schools and the Great Schools
Okay,
Partnership.
yep.
That's been an incredible asset because we've been able to communicate with schools from Maine, Rhode Island. We're gonna actually go visit a school in Danvers. It's a small magnet
Okay.
school to kind of look and see what they're doing for proficiency-based models. So supporting the League initiatives would help a lot.
Okay.
To be honest, we use that grant money every year to send people to visit schools, and that's a huge help to us as well.
Okay, thanks.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. Are there any other announcements from board members? Okay. A very brief report on behalf of the chair. Through a mutual friend, I recently had a great phone conversation with the chair of the Massachusetts State Board of Education, a woman by the name of Mara Banta, who works for IBM and actually has some connection to Vermont with the IBM plan in Vermont. And I looked, she was very encouraging that maybe there were things that Vermont and Massachusetts, as contrary as it might seem, could do together. And so I just want to alert you on that. The only other part of my report is to tell you that I spent a fair amount of time in Montpelier in the last month and a half, obviously without a lot of success, but I'll save those particular comments until we get to the legislative update. So, moving on, yes.
I did actually, the last Standards Board meeting, which also meets again this week, there was a lot of discussion on clarifying what issues were going to take place in the licensing process. And it is a process, and they're very grateful to the agency for their input and their guidance in that. So it's, I would say it's a bit of a work in progress, but they plan to vote on some changes this week. So.
Okay. Moving on to committee reports, I would suggest we save the legislative committee report, Bill, until we get to the legislative update.
That was going to be my suggestion as well.
Well, you all know that there's something wrong with this meeting. Bill and I are in full agreement.
Isn't over yet.
For 5 seconds.
Right. And I suspect the SU Governance Committee has nothing they'd like.
Full agreement.
Okay. Is there a member, I noticed that Bonnie is not here, but is there a member of the Strategic Planning Committee? Has that committee met in the last month?
No.
Moving on to the Secretary's report.
All right. I'm going to leave anything referring to the balanced accountability model till the end, because we're coming back to that later. And I'm going to apologize. I feel like I'm under assault by every birch tree in the state of Vermont, so I'm very congested. I just wanted to pick up, first of all, by talking about the personalized learning plans, because those came up here, so I'll speak to that first. We're very excited, the agency, to be partnering with VSAC to support a platform, Naviance platform, that will be a statewide platform available to all schools in the state for $1 a head. So it's a, if you've got 25 seniors or 25 kids, you've got $25 fee to use this platform. And it's a tool that we selected after analyzing all the career and college planning tools that were available in the market and being used currently in Vermont. It's the one that's most widely used in Vermont, but we're in transition. It isn't being supported the way it was, and we're actually moving towards a model that was modified to support the PLP process. And it's been it was chosen for its functionality. It's user-friendly counselor tools. It's easy for counselors to use it to provide both college and career counseling, but also to build in the personalized learning components, and it's pervasively used, so scaling it out to the remaining schools is going to be relatively simple. It's not disruptive, and it just extends a widely used resource to the few schools, particularly the really small schools, that haven't been able to take advantage of it, because it's available now at a much lower subsidized price. Schools that are already using Naviance will be able to renegotiate on the new terms, so that most schools will see a substantial reduction in cost for that work. So we're very excited about that, and we expect that to be available as a resource. Obviously, no one has to use it, but given the experience of schools that are using it, including, I think, yours, it's a useful tool. And the schools that do use it will benefit from the work of groups that were in the PLP planning process and have already begun to experiment. So that it's been test-driven and modified in response to use, so that's very exciting. Another piece coming out of the legislative session, and I know Jill will speak to this later as well, but I wanted to just call it out because it's particularly exciting to us, is that one of the things that we've been grappling with at the agency is how to support multi-tiered systems of support and more inclusive learning environments for all students with disabilities, and also ensure that we're meeting sort of the stringent guidelines for approved uses of special education funding. And one of the paradoxes of more inclusive approaches to educating kids with disabilities is that if you're successful, you will actually have less hands-on time by your special education staff with students. So when you think about the kinds of time studies that special educators are required to do to justify reimbursement, the paradox is that when they're successful, they actually can't demonstrate the reimbursement, the need for reimbursement. On the other hand, schools can't take the risk to move to those more inclusive environments if they don't have what might appear to be excess staffing. So we are concerned with what we see as a pattern where the way we reimburse may inadvertently, in some cases, be driving schools towards special education practice that we feel is both very costly and very bad for children. It's, I think the most obvious manifestation of this is heavy reliance on paraprofessionals who, though they're wonderful, are not trained teachers and effectively become a person between the child who most needs high-skilled teaching and the actual person who's trained to deliver it. So in response to that, we asked the legislature to approve a modified special education block grant, which raises the threshold for the basic block grant in schools that apply to us and are intending to use a whole school intervention that supports more inclusive environments and multi-tiered systems, and also focuses on social-emotional learning and developing social-emotional capacity. And in this case, we're targeting the SWIFT schools. There's 4 districts and 12 schools, I think, that are piloting the SWIFT model. I think you've heard about this in another meeting. And they will apply to be eligible for this modified special ed block grant. And as part of that planning process and application process, they're going to demonstrate how they're going to reduce their reliance on things like the one-on-one paraprofessionals for special education and replace it with a more inclusive model. Because the block grant will be increased for those schools, they won't have to do the exhaustive time studies. So that will give them some freedom for that work. We're conducting it in a pilot level, first of all, because we realize that there's potential for risk in any intervention, so we're treating this as an experiment, and if it's successful and we monitor its results and we begin to see outcomes, we'll be able to make a recommendation to the legislature that they consider extending this opportunity to other programs. We're targeting SWIFT because SWIFT, like PBIS, has demonstrated results. It works empirically in that it's when schools have embraced it as a whole school intervention and have implemented with fidelity. What we're seeing is much lower referrals to special ed, lower referrals to discipline as well. So we're trying to find ways to increase flexibility to support what we think of as evidence-based practice. And we're just very excited about that. We've also been working with Michael Giangreco, I don't know if anyone knows UVM, and he's been invaluable in helping us think about what some of those interventions might be. I will give you one heads up in terms of assessment. We had a meeting in Minneapolis this month with the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium to talk about the standard setting process, and we're going to come back to it this afternoon, so I won't belabor that piece. But one of the things that we have been pushing, and I've been pushing on very aggressively since January, is asking Smarter Balanced to prepare a white paper on what they see as appropriate and inappropriate uses of testing. And I'm thrilled to report that they've come a very long way from January. when they said that they couldn't, and Arnie Duncan said he couldn't, because, so we were caught in this catch-22. Smarter Balance has now had a discussion with their technical advisory committee, and they're moving forward on a proposal for a white paper. Two of the professors, academics who will be on it are Linda Darling-Hammond and Ed Hartle. I think they're not confirmed yet, but it's one of the people they've requested. That gives you a little sense of the group, or the direction it will take. It is going to particularly focus on the uses of testing as something separate, and that speaks to the policy world in terms of what some of the mandated uses are for testing. But I see this as a huge step forward, and I think when you know the research of some of those individuals, it gives you a sense of where we are. These conferences have been incredibly helpful for us as a state. I mean, our joke in the agency is that we're the flea on the tail of the dog. We have so few students. We're smaller than districts in many states, despite the fact we have more districts than just about every state. But it's been incredibly useful to network there, and in particular, we have been forming some pretty strong partnerships with California. And if you've been reading Linda Darling-Hammond's recent work, writing in, she's on leave, and it's not academic, but in the public press, you've probably heard her referring to something that sounds very similar to our education quality reviews. And we are working intentionally to foster that movement in parallel. And I think increasingly we're the gadfly, and they're the gravitas at the table, they're the Goliath in the room. Any accountability process that comes out of a new reauthorization process is going to have to acknowledge California. And California is now proudly and adamantly one of the non-waiver states, and is really focused on multiple measures and shifting from the ranking and sorting to a focus on continuous growth and learning. And I think that is going to leave us in a much, much better position when it comes to reauthorization, whenever that comes. On the less positive note, the U.S. Department of Education did send out a letter last week talking about the waiver process, because as you've been following in the press, some states are being forced to give up because they aren't able to deliver on the use of test scores for teacher value-added models for a whole bunch of reasons. Most, certainly in cases where legislatures have taken votes against them, but also just unable to move through or having concerns about implementation. So far, there are a couple delayed responses by US DOE to states that both sought waivers and received Race to the Top funding. And the million-dollar question is, when a Race to the Top state that received extensive funding for implementation of teacher value-added models says they can't do it, will they be compelled to return the money? We don't know, and that hasn't happened yet. And the delay in responding to places where that seems to be happening is making us wonder if their goal is to wait till after the midterm elections. So we don't know. But I think what is clear is that the system is broken, and I think that at some point it's going to collapse. What we see is that there are increasing states that are having trouble delivering on this for many of the reasons that you'll talk. When I did follow up to that letter, because US DOE said that they were looking at flexibility around the waivers, and I thought that I would go back and see if flexibility included removing the requirement that we evaluate and sanction principals and teachers based on their students' test scores, and it does not. So they're still keeping that. And when I asked them, I asked her point blank, so what you're saying is we need to do something that you're agreeing is statistically indefensible? She said yes. So they know it's not defensible, but they're also going to say that we have to do it if we want to have access to the federal resources. So I just want you to know nothing has changed on that front to support children and improve their own professional practice as colleagues, sort of what I would call professional accountability rather than test-based accountability. And I'm sure we'll come back to these issues in the context of the discussion later. It pretty much sums up where we are.
Bill is smiling.
What's that?
Bill is smiling.
Well,
It's predictable. I mean, I think if you talk to any teacher, I think they could tell you how the students would score before they took the test. And I think most teachers would have told you in 2001 that this is the situation we would be in 2014. And the question is, when will we have the political public will to actually develop a system that, instead of ranking and sorting, helps people actually do the work they intend to do and is a little bit more respectful. And I think if high-stakes accountability worked, we would see enormous astronomical gains across the state. The whole presumption is that teachers just weren't trying, and so now we're going to punish them so that they try. And that clearly hasn't worked because we haven't seen the improvements in any of the places that it's taken place. And I think the reality is what professionals need is good data they can use to improve practice, and that's where we need to move as a state. A couple other pieces. We have the
Stephen, can I ask a question on the special ed? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So on the special ed in the block grants and the non-time sample districts, is that, even though the legislation passed something, is that going to get those districts out of the Fed's requirement to pass the money through?
No, it's mostly, it's not, first of all, there's still, one of the reasons we have the reimbursement system in the first place is because we have very many small schools, and it's sort of an insurance system for small schools, because if you have one student with multiple intense needs that moves into a district, it could be, a huge expense added on a small budget, and so it's a way to insulate small schools from that kind of variability and cost. What we're doing with this will still be fine with the federal government, and what it's doing is just increasing the basic block grant allocation, which is sort of considered the cost of doing special ed, as opposed to there will still be reimbursement.
So the time samples weren't really tied to that, in essence?
We already give a basic block grant, which is the cost of doing special education services, and for that grant, you don't have to document the time on services. Over and beyond that, we will continue to have reimbursement model, because even in these 12 schools, some of them are small, they may still have somebody move in with a very complex set of needs that require, intensive investments of resources, and we still want to protect them in the event of that so that those children receive necessary services. What we're doing is just lifting the ceiling a bit so they have a little more flexibility to provide support pushed into the classroom and do the multi-tiered sort of more inclusive models.
Thank you.
Another thing the legislature passed was some resources and a position to support expansion of common chart of accounts for the state of Vermont. Right now, and I think you've heard this at several meetings, but I wanted you to know that they did support this. The development work of the common chart of accounts is mostly done. We need to finish a handbook and provide some support for implementation across the state, and that's where those resources will go. This won't solve the challenges of comparability, because those will always be occluded by issues of governance structure and make it difficult to make comparisons. But it's a baby step towards comparability, so that within certain controlled parameters, we will be able to help districts get a better sense of what the return is they're getting, because we'll have more clarity about where resources are going, and that's a huge step forward. It's hard on a board to evaluate whether you're investing in the right things if you can't figure out what you're getting for it. I also want to say that we have now in place a public safety position that we're sharing with the Department of Public Safety, and this is a person who is half-time there, half-time in our office. We should have a website up to illustrate the role he's playing in the education domain, and we're absolutely thrilled to have him working at the state level to coordinate with individual districts and identify best practice in terms of safety planning and ensuring that every school has a plan around communications and strategies for keeping children safe in their schools. Wish we didn't have to have this, we do. And I was at a state training recently, and the scenario began with it's 8 o'clock in the morning and there's a bomb threat. And the solution was that only one person would control communications at the school. I just looked at my cell phone and said, you need a different plan. And that's what Rob is going to do. He's going to help schools think through the logistics of how you mitigate, how you anticipate to reduce the probability of incidents, and then how you mitigate, so that in the terrible and unfortunate and hopefully never seen case that there is a bad incident, that at least you approach it strategically as a district in a way that minimizes the damage and the disruption to students and keeps them safe. So we're absolutely thrilled about that. Related to that, our legal team is now working with the legal team of the VSA and VisBet to review our hazing and harassment and bullying procedures and protocols, because we have been made aware that they're written differently, the two different policies, one for bullying, one for harassment, and that may actually cause problems for districts and make it difficult for districts to approach incidents in a coherent way. So we're working with that, and then we will bring that back to a focus group, hopefully with the help of Tracy Sugawa, to get feedback and continue to do that work. And it's just another example of how different individuals in the agency are also trying to work with different stakeholders to capitalize really on the extensive know-how. VisBet's interesting because it sees it from the back end. They see all the terrible cases that went awry in terms of cases that were handled badly. And we're hoping to learn from that about what to do and what not to do so that we can provide proactive advice to school districts so they can manage risk effectively in a way that reduces disruption and, again, reduces harm to children.
You mean in terms of insurance claims? The VisBet part?
Yes. And then the last piece that I was going to address is, as you all know, we're losing Carol, and we're devastated to be losing Carol. Though we probably have to give Carol new office space if she stayed.
And that would be well-deserved, by the way.
But I did want to say that we are moving forward on a plan. We just haven't had time to cross all our Ts and dot our Is, but we're hoping to have someone in place by next week so that we can have an extensive overlap period, because I think it's pretty clear, talking to Carol, that the work has evolved substantially, and it's time to revisit the role and think about what it is and how it should be shaped to best support the work of the board. So we want to make sure that we have that in place to take shameless advantage of her time before she goes away.
So when you make that decision, you'll either let me know and I can let the full board know, or you can let
Right.
the full board know.
Right,
So
absolutely.
we should have notice of that before we get together for our board retreat.
And I think the hope would be to have a new person at the board retreat for the duration as well.
Yes. Although Carol will be there as well.
We think redundancy is a good thing when you have a
Right,
transition.
right.
Okay.
Any other questions for Rebecca? Not, we'll move on. Jill, to the, do you want to do the, you want Jill to start off, or you want to start off with this legislative?
I'm gonna let Jill has already done this once and she did a wonderful job.
Good morning, Jill Remick from the Agency of Education. Yes, I have done this a few times now. I hope I get it right. The short story is I think we dodged more bullets than we took. That's my take on the session. You folks should have a document that looks something like this. It's basically my attempt at a summary of the pieces that did pass and their impact on the board and the agency. And I also pulled out from each of those bills the language that really directs work to the agency, because what we're trying to do is really be proactive about taking this work on sooner rather than later, and being strategic about it rather than scrambling in the fall to write reports and get things together. And a lot of the bills, even though they were relatively straightforward, the ones that did pass, do require a lot of work on our part. So the session adjourned on Saturday the 10th. As you folks are well aware, there were a lot of pretty big pieces of legislation that were related to education that dominated the session, but they just didn't quite end up passing. On Saturday of the adjournment, there was the possible expectation that they would suspend the rules to really quickly move through the Senate version of their version of a governance bill to the House, and then they would have to form a conference committee and get together. And that did not happen. So basically, what passed out of the House is a governance bill, H-83, that did not get taken up by the Senate. The Senate then took the miscellaneous education bill and did their own version, which was very different, and that did not make it through. So we're going to talk in a little while a little bit more about the governance piece, because obviously that took a lot of your time and our time and attention and the legislature's attention, and it made it further than we've seen it go in at least the 10 years I've been at the agency. And I think we could fully expect that to come back next year. So we'll talk about that afterwards. But back to the pieces that did pass, I'll just quickly run through, and if that's what you folks would like. H-270, you might remember from last session, this is the bill that further expands pre-K and allows families to have their students participate in pre-kindergarten out of the district. The example that I would use is if you have a parent who lives in one town and works in another that's in a different district, you could conceivably bring your child with you to the town that you're working in and have them go to that pre-K instead. This also has a good deal of monitoring requirements for us and AHS. So we definitely have a team of folks at the agency unpacking this and working on that.
Did they include staffing for this monitoring?
No. So we do have the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant, which does have some funding for the monitoring piece, but there are a lot of other pieces in this bill that did not, that doesn't cover, that we are hoping to at least redirect some of our resources towards. But no, there wasn't. And there was discussion about that last session, about how many positions we would need. But it actually seemed like the idea of adding positions was a threat to the bill, and so they did not include positions for us, but the work is there.
A comment on that, that's just setting up a very unfortunate set of circumstances, is that if you don't have the monitoring capability to do this stuff right, and there are people who are not running schools or preschools as they should, and that hits the media, and there's no monitoring, then there's going to be a great deal of finger pointing, et cetera.
Right.
This is just not wise governance, I don't think. But I'm sure that you folks agree on that point.
Right, and I do think that having the Early Learning Challenge, the federal grant, will at least beef up the monitoring piece, but there's a lot more to that monitoring. There's the analysis of that, and evaluation of that in time. So, yeah, that's a big one.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the defined as 3 and 4-year-olds? So in other words, it says 35 weeks annually to any pre-kindergarten children. So is it left up to the districts to?
Let's see. I bet they have a definition here.
It's
Let's
3
see.
and 4-year-olds, it's as opposed to 2-year-olds.
As opposed to 4-year-olds?
It says,
3 and 4.
as of the date established by the district of residence for kindergarten eligibility is 3 or 4 years of age, or is 5 years of age, but is not yet enrolled in kindergarten. So apparently the district could set what the kindergarten eligibility is, and then that would determine their eligibility for pre-K.
That's the September 1st cutoff, or whatever it is, and different districts have slightly different days.
That's a really good point, though. That could,
Well, I know some districts, they take 4-year-olds, but they, I mean, there's such an abundance of 3 and 4-year-olds that some districts have taken the 4-year-olds first. Others do it by need, and so obviously 10 hours a week is not that, I mean, it's an amount, but it's certainly not a significant amount in terms of education. I'm not talking about cost.
right.
So,
And a lot of the places, a lot of the districts have been able to use federal title funds to support pre-K, and because of this, they now wouldn't be able to do that. So the hope is that they could at least reallocate those title funds to add to the 10 hours, but they no longer can use that for the first 10 hours. So we're working to provide guidance to districts on that as well. That's a change. Let's see.
So for example, some schools will use the ed spending now to implement their 10 hours a week of preschool, and they might use some of the Title I monies to provide care beyond that.
H-884 was the miscellaneous tax bill, which sets the funding parameters. It also includes a study for us at the agency to come back to the legislature on the current tuition practices and setting rates across the state. So we'll add that to our growing list of reports we need to do every year. H-85 was the big bill, so that was the,
Got a quick question on 884. The fast growth provision, you're talking about the rolling 2-year average?
I missed his question.
Section
Oh, okay.
53 removes the fast growth provision in the ADM count.
Didn't hear the right clogged ears.
oh, is that for the phantom students? Is that right?
It's the phantoms on the up end.
Okay.
It's not on the bottom end, I think. It's the hold harmless on the bottom, and it's the fast growth provision. It must be.
Okay, well.
Vaughn, is that right? Yes. The funding formula insulates you against both rapid reductions. It holds your effective decline in enrollment to 3.5% a year. That's why Rochester currently is reimbursed for 40 more students than they have. On the up end, it also restricts the growth?
Actually, it allows you.
Or allows you to grow faster? Okay. Okay. And that's what they're capping, so that you can't increase your expenditures rapidly when you have rising enrollments.
Okay.
It forces you to control the marginal cost of additional students.
H80, 885.
So you folks might remember, we had proposed some miscellaneous education language for inclusion in the miscellaneous education bill, updating the language to be in line with the education quality standards, providing some updated current technical education language, updating the section on educational support teams to be more in line with the best practices that we're implementing on multi-tiered systems of support. So that was H876, which was the miscellaneous education bill, and that ended up being the vehicle that the Senate had added the governance pieces to, and so it ended up not passing. So we were able to get some of the pieces that we really felt strongly needed to get through into the budget bill adjustment. One of those was a piece that allows the state to participate in a reciprocity agreement for offering online post-secondary programs. And we also, I believe I had mentioned this to you folks before, there's a very small group of students, I think it's 17 this year, who are placed in Vermont awaiting adoption, but they haven't yet formally been assigned guardianship in Vermont, and so they're not really considered state-placed because they were placed from a different jurisdiction out of Vermont, and they're not considered residents yet, so they've been in this limbo. And what it does is it makes Vermont school districts, they certainly provide the education for these kids, but then they need to try to recoup some of the expenses from other state school districts. So this allows us to count those kids in that particular situation as state-placed students. So we were able to get those pieces in there. Let's see if there was anything else on page 885. Then there are just a couple smaller pieces that I thought were worth noting. H217 is related to tobacco on all kinds of different levels, but one of the sections addressed tobacco on school grounds, and it kind of firms up the language around when it is permissible on school grounds. And also, I believe I sent out to you folks a bill 497. It's about the open meeting law, and it clarifies the rules regarding electronic communications and teleconferencing, and also requirements for posting things like agendas and minutes on websites. If I didn't send that to you folks, I will send that to you when I sit back down, because that seemed worth bringing up, not only for you folks, but also, of course, for districts.
Generally, how would that affect the open meeting, the revisions of the open meeting law affect our operations?
It has a few sections that really expand on when an email communication amongst members becomes a meeting and what that is and how you could deal with that by warning it electronically.
It also reduces the fines.
Sorry?
It reduces the fines if you are found in violation of the open meeting laws.
Jill, I know at one
I
point
skipped a bunch, didn't I?
they were also deliberating whether the timing on your meeting deviated from the agenda as well.
Yep.
Because there have been conflicts in some districts where they've said they were going to discuss something at some point, and then they didn't, and they put it someplace else, and people missed the meeting.
Okay. I skipped an entire page of my update, I apologize.
Well,
I knew there was more
think-
to H85.
I
but you
think we
folks-
should all take a good look at the open meeting law.
Yep.
Because I know that, that this board is very active, it communicates, but there are some occasions where we are in violation. So I think when Jill sends that, we need to all read it and make sure that we are abiding by it.
I've noticed that Carol has been jumping on every email telling people not to do it, and that's really helped a lot. So I think we should thank Carol for slapping hands.
But I think it's
She's very good about that.
this is made it a little more rigid or a little more clear anyway.
I hope so.
So,
You can always include the dialogue in the actual meeting too. I mean, as part of the record.
That's true.
I think as a practice, though, I think that the
Believe me.
conversation shouldn't happen on email, they should happen in open meeting. I'm going to disagree, Sean, right?
I think I just would add, because I know we want to have time to talk further about governance, the items that I mentioned about educational quality standards and so on, we do plan to bring those back next session, along with any additions that you folks in the agency develop over the next several months. Like I said, the governance, consolidation, expansion of school districts conversation is expected to return. So as of right now, with no change in the legislation, Acts 153 of 2010 and 156 of 2012 remain the law of the land.
The fact that the language reflecting the changes in the education quality standards did not make it in legislation, does that have any effect on those rules and regulations?
No.
Implementation of them?
Right, it's simply titles of pieces, so it's still called school quality standards, but it directs the board to establish the standards, so that doesn't change. And then it requires the schools to develop a plan. I think in statute it's called a continuous improvement plan, or no, that's a comprehensive action plan. And in EQS, we've changed that to the comprehensive.
So it's just updating statutes more than having any effect on the...
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
Great.
And with that, maybe I'll ask if, Vaughn, do you mind joining me up here to talk a little bit more about
Before we
the
get
governance?
into, I want to get Bill's thoughts on legislation.
Okay.
But I also want to make note, I think, of a point Bill was making, that as we develop our legislative priorities for the next session, I think it's maybe really not board activity, but I think we need to be very supportive of some consideration for the agency budget. You know, over the last few years, this budget has been dramatically cut, and I think that we need to be proactive, and as you all know, a good hefty portion of the budget is already federally funded. But I think it's going to be time for the state to step up. Now, I'm not sure the economy is going to be any better next year than it is now, but there's clearly a need here, and so I think we need to be supportive.
It will affect, I mean, I already was teasing Bill about one of his suggestions in the assessment piece, that we can't jeopardize the federal funding at this point because it's so critical to the field, but it's also that it supports over north of 65% of our positions at this point. And so we are fundamentally a federal agency more than we're a state agency at this point. And that's, you know, when people ask us to respond to state level needs, we are constricted in our capacity to do that because the federal monies cannot be used to support state agenda unless they're consistent.
We've made that point in our legislative agenda every year. And then it gets into the budget process, and the governor puts in his targets for each of the agencies, and then that disappears and is never heard from again. But it doesn't do a thing about the real problem.
Bill, do you have some comments on the legislative session, or?
Oh, what an interesting session. I think that we probably need to spend some time in the retreat talking about what positions we should take and what kind of positions we should take. I would give you only one example, is that the board did endorse the consolidation legislation, but then it didn't really have taken any action on the Senate version of things. And all of a sudden, at the last hour, that looked like that could have happened. But we really didn't have a position on that, so I think we need to rethink and take some time thoughtfully, maybe at the retreat, to say, what is it that we're going to take positions on and what are we not? Should we be taking positions on principles such as the proper funding of the agency, which you can put in a simple statement, but endorsing a particular piece of legislation when the game changed as it did in the 11th hour, then we were not, I think that the way that the Senate was lined up was the way the Senate was lined up. That's all there was to it. But nevertheless, we need to think about flexibility and how we would do that as a board. What's the role of the secretary? Because Jill is the person there and the secretary is the person there on a daily basis. And there are lots of jinx, and the maneuvering in the end game was likened to nothing I have seen before.
Well, I was there through a lot of that, and I had seen it before. It may have been a little more confusing
That
this
may
time.
be fair, it just seemed pretty
A little more
close
confusing
to
this
it.
time than it was in my day, but, it's, you know, it's always going to be like that at the end of the session. So I don't know how a board that, you know, meets monthly is going to be able to do that. I was very careful when I was testifying before Senate Ed and Senate Finance, that made it very clear that we had not taken a position on H-876, do I have that number right? Yes, sir. But that there were things in the bill that we had, I felt, taken a position on when we took our strong position on H-83. So I was very careful to point those things out, the differences, but at the same time saying that, no, we have not had a discussion on this, but there were things in the bill that, you know, we did not favor based on our discussion on 883. And I think, Bill, you're always going to be in a predicament like that at the end of a legislative session. So, you know, I guess I say this with some hesitation, but one of the problems I had in this process was once the board takes a strong position, I have some difficulty when individual board members take individual opinions before, out in the public or before legislative committees. And I think that's something we might talk about at the retreat. Stacy?
I was reflecting also where the need to be flexible and responsive also corresponds with the open meeting conversation we were just having. It'd be easy for us to, through email, say, oh, this is happening in the moment, and what do people think? And obviously, we can't do that. Maybe something else to talk about is, do we want, this is crazy, but do we want to schedule another meeting that's towards the end of the legislative session? I mean, we schedule our meetings that we meet monthly, except for we meet twice, you know, at the end of April and beginning of May. It doesn't necessarily allow us to respond to like minute-by-minute changes, but if we want to have that active role, then maybe that's something we should be willing to do, to meet again.
A further thought, and this is retreat discussion too. If we're a policy board, we need to look at and carefully reflect on the pros and cons of a particular thing. It's not like the legislative process, which has a great deal of partisan nature to it. That's just the way it is. But it's like this work session this afternoon where we're looking at the accreditation, if you will, process and the school approval process and the assessment thing, in which we think thoughtfully, you know, about where we should be going. And I think that's probably our best role, but that's a bigger discussion. To get into the political tumble, we're just not in that kind of capacity.
Although it was encouraging, to me anyway, on this bill, it was not a partisan issue. It was more a geographic issue than partisan.
Yes,
and
it
that
was.
was refreshing to see. Margaret?
I think Bill's suggestion that we take positions on principles rather than on specific bills is helpful when you get to the end of the session and you get all those changes, because then there's clarity about the issues we're supporting rather than are we supporting specific legislation or not. And I think that that discussion around principles would be beneficial for the board, and we may be able to reach more agreement around principles than we sometimes are around specific legislation.
Rebecca?
One of the things I'd like to put on the table for the board to just consider is one of the things that we noticed that we're really concerned about in the Senate version was that there was an effort to remove a lot of the authority to the board and put it into the secretary. And we worked very hard against that, but I think that the board should be mindful of that and ask where that came from and what it signals. And that happened at the end hour, and it was very difficult to push back on.
Well,
and so I think you should be mindful of that as a board.
Now, there's an example of something I testified against in Senate Finance and felt pretty comfortable that I was supporting the full board when I did that. I did not need to contact everybody, but I didn't realize it was difficult. I got the sense that it
We spent, I think, a week working on that.
Oh,
Is that fair to
okay.
say, Jill?
I must have shown up at the end of the
You
week
showed up at the end.
taking all the credit for it then, huh?
You know, and there was so much different in what the Senate came up with in the House. You know, the House, the state board played a major role, and I think there was even a position allocated to the board to support them in the House version. I mean, it was just a very different take on the entire process.
And the final Senate version was very different from the initial Senate version, which had us really concerned.
The bottom line was, in my opinion, The Senate had little interest in this legislation from the very beginning. And to demonstrate that, a couple of things. The Senate Education Committee would argue that, that the House bill never arrived until very late in the session, beyond the crossover date. But if the Senate had any interest in a particular subject, they would have started hearings in advance, whether they had a bill or not, historically speaking.
I think both pieces of what you said are true. It did come over late, and the Senate didn't have any interest in it.
Right, and to further demonstrate that, I found it very interesting that that there were Senate Finance and maybe one other committee that was interjecting itself into the substance of a particular field that normally would have been left to the Education Committee. So I think you look at those things, those two things and a few other things, and it was predictable and clear from the very beginning that the Senate had no interest in looking at the governance structure of the Vermont educational system. I fully appreciate how difficult this issue is, particularly growing up and living in a small rural area and knowing the importance of what school boards think they have. But this issue, I think, will be before us next year, and this board, I would suggest, needs to take a position on it once again.
Can I have one more comment?
Sure.
I also feel like I have to say that for the last weeks of the legislature, we had Vaughn and Jill there pretty much full-time, Brad, Bill, and Aaron over there pretty much full-time. And these are all people who have other jobs. And so that really is taxing, and I want to throw that out because I know that some people in this group also want some data and are, to advance the discussion further in the interim. And I say that because the people who are doing the work, who do the analysis, are the people here at this table and the others I mentioned. And so to the extent that the board can figure out what its primary purposes are and then focus on questions and be intentful and purposeful about the kinds of questions it wants to answer and the data necessary to answer that, that's really helpful to us. It allows us to approach this in a coherent way. What's very difficult, and what was difficult about the legislative session, was competing contradictory requests that weren't integrated. And it's very difficult to present analysis in a coherent way under those circumstances. And so to the extent that you can be intentional about what it is you want to understand, we can be intentional in terms of how we respond and provide support for that information. Does that sort of summarize it?
Absolutely.
It's difficult to support boards and legislatures well if they're not focused.
Other questions or comments on this?
How would we attack the staffing problem and the support problem?
Well, we're in that we're no longer responsible for managing the agency. It is, it wouldn't be a primary response, but or primary responsibility. But I would just suggest that, it's in the best interest of education, the best interest of our operations and the agency's operations if we're supportive. So I would look to the agency to make their suggestion. The agency has a whole political process to go through that we don't have to go through, i.e. you got to get your budget approved by the governor. But at the point that, and we'll take this up later, that, if the agency is indeed looking for additional funding, I think this board needs to be very supportive of it.
Yes, I would. This is something we can talk about later, but where would the pressure points be, and who do we need to talk to at what times to be effective in making this thing happen?
Well, it may be delicate because,
Yes.
the secretary could come to us and say, hey, I'm not getting very far, I need some help, but yet the secretary works for the governor, not for the State Board of Education anymore, so
There are things, though, for example, in the education quality review process, where the implications to fully implement with integrity the policies of the board, we may need additional support in certain areas. And I think I'll talk later about how we're trying to address that. But I think that's where I'd be mindful. On the legislative side, I think of the hazing, harassment, and bullying task force. I don't question that it's an incredibly important issue, but I can't help but note that that entire division was ripped out of the agency a few years ago. And the problem is a task force that doesn't have any staffing to support it is not going to be as effective as we'd like it to be. And you know, I offer that as an analogy because I think in the same way, policy that's transformative but doesn't have staff to support it is less likely to achieve the ambitions of the board as well.
If there are no other comments, I would suggest we take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back to Vaughn's report. So we'll be back here at 11:15.
One big pot, so I'm
I've asked
guessing.
Vaughn to give us a update on where we are with various governance issues that have come before the board. And as you know, one of them is that at the June meeting, we will be taking up the Rochester School District proposal. My understanding is that the superintendents have indeed met. I think Vaughn has a report. And that, so that'll be a big issue on the June agenda. So I would caution you today in getting into the details of that, in that representatives of that area are not here today. But I thought it would be helpful if we at least saw where we were in that process, and then Vaughn also will give us some details and some other things that are happening in that. So with that wonderful introduction, Vaughn.
As I distribute this letter that begins, "Dear Mr. Morse," dated May 4th, I don't know the day in which it appeared in Chairman Morse's mailbox, but it was date stamped May 15th at the agency. Thanks. And then this is just another handout on the districts that you had directed to have boundary studies, and in February, you made the boundary studies optional, and where they've gone. I will be very brief on the situation in Windsor Northwest, since you will discuss it next week. You have the response.
Let's do the general update
Oh,
first.
General, yes, sir.
Please.
Okay. There were 5 supervisor unions / districts directed by the state board to have boundary studies, and then in February, the February meeting, they were made optional. And they were told to tell us what they decided. I made a series of phone calls last week. Some of them had. Essex Caledonia did respond that they had opted out of the boundary study quite promptly. Orange East had a very good reason for, excuse the typo, not replying. Have to keep remembering spreadsheets don't have spell checks automatically. They wanted to look at what happened in the legislature, and they wanted to think about where to go at that point. So they will be having that discussion and letting us know. In Washington South, the superintendent informed us that the border study had been suspended, and she expected a formal motion at the SU board's next meeting. And again, I suspect that there will be a discussion of legislative activity interwoven with that discussion as well. In Wyndham Southwest, Superintendent McClemens informed the agency that the SU had suspended the boundary study, and Winooski, days before your decision, submitted a report recommending against merger. They did, however, detail plans for coordinating activities, particularly with Burlington. Certainly, those 2 districts are, if not the most culturally diverse, among the most culturally diverse, and bordering each other. There seems to be a possibility of some significant collaborations. They're also looking into food services, and I'm sure some other things as well. So they've started a fruitful discussion, and they're not interested in the boundary change, but they're interested in other kinds of cooperation. Would you like the update on other SUs that have been active now, and then we'll move to this.
Wyndham Central?
Wyndham Central is
Just
one
to
of...
why don't you remind the
Right.
board what happened with that?
Wyndham, that was exactly part of my next three.
Oh, pardon me.
I'm sorry. No,
Okay.
I didn't write them down because this was the five.
Okay.
Wyndham Central is still active. You, I believe in November, approved their report. As we added up the numbers, it turned out that they had not allowed enough days for possible petition to reconsider, and it had been approved. They were going to get back, do the counting, get back, and they weren't going to meet the original vote date they'd hoped for, and they were going to work out new dates. I imagine Carol would have put it on the consent agenda. While they were in the process of doing that, the legislative discussion about governance, the nature of it, began to become public, and they felt an obligation to delay things until they saw the results of that discussion. They're going to meet in May. I don't know whether in May they'll be able to simply go forward or whether they'll think that they need to study more. But at some point, they will get back to you. They are in a peculiar state where you've approved their report, which in the agency's view means if they were to do anything else, they would need your permission to withdraw or suspend the report. I have no reason to believe they're doing that. This was literally, we think it's prudent to see what's happening.
So you'll follow up on that before our next meeting then?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Chittenden East is very actively involved, moving forward, studying a modified unified union school district. You may recall they had a regional education district vote, which passed 4 of the 6 districts, lost narrowly in Richmond and overwhelmingly in Huntington. In a modified unified union with 4 affirmative districts, they would be able to form a modified unified union. The other 2 would stay in the union for the grades it now operates, beginning with grade 5, and then they would continue to operate their own local districts.
Does that mean you would end up with another superintendent?
No, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear enough. Instead of having one superintendent inside a red, you would still need a supervisory union office outside of the MUD and the 1 or possibly 2 other districts. You'd have a superintendent for Chittenden East, and the superintendent would be the executive officer of the Modified Unified Union School District and any districts less than a majority of elementary districts that chose to be.
So the simple answer is yes. They would have another superintendent. They would need another superintendent office.
They would keep the superintendent office they have now. It wouldn't be another. The Modified Unified Union District is not going to have a superintendent other than the one that is there, and that will be the same superintendent for any elementary districts that choose not to be part of the Modified Unified Union.
Okay.
Another way to explain it is the votes, in terms of how many votes you take. That's another way.
Right. Basically, the way it would need to be done, because the districts that maintain their local control over, in this case, pre-K 4, their budgets need to be voted. There needs to be an elementary budget voted for the Modified Unified Union they don't participate in, and then there needs to be a 5 through 12 vote that everybody currently in the union participates in. And then above that, there's one superintendent for all of them.
What about the representation to the union?
That's a wonderful question. And
That's the 333 number.
Mr. James and I suggested that that should be defined to the Education Committee at the time. The amendment was proposed fairly late. And in fact, it was people from Chittenden East who were most interested in the amendment, and they assured the committee that this was precisely the sort of decision that the study committee could make for itself. So it is still going to have to meet the standard of one person, one vote, but in terms of being able to give you a structure, I can't because there isn't one. I suspect when they realize what they need to do to get accurate tax rates and things like that, once it's been done, there's going to be a fairly substantial one, and it will absolutely have to be in compliance with the one person, one vote.
But I think the question was, would the representation of the union districts outvote the two small towns?
Well, I don't know what it would look like, but obviously with the modified district, you have one board.
Yes.
And then what would be the representation from that to the union district, or to the SU?
On the
I
unified
mean, so
board.
what you're saying is they'll take the modified district, figure out the one person, one vote calculation relative to the others, and then it gets to what you're talking about, in the sense that in the SU, they're gonna be overwhelming.
In the SU,
Not
it's exactly the opposite.
Yeah, they'll
You'd
have
the
the
two-
underrepresented.
And what
The SU, it won't be right, it'd be like the Senate,
What
right?
was happening didn't come to pass because the Reds didn't pass, but the plan had been, in those cases, to petition the board so that representation on the larger unit would still be fairly represented. It wouldn't be 3 for a modified unified union that operated multiple schools, and then 3 each for one or possibly 2 small districts. But for that, they would need to come to the board for a waiver, and we'd expect them to do that.
Okay.
And they would come with a recommendation, and you would evaluate the recommendation. Okay, so that is moving forward.
You said there was one more?
I am very sad to tell you that until last night, there was one more, in that Orleans Southwest voted not to go forward with a consolidation vote. They'd invited me there. They were struggling. They're an especially complicated district. If they had a non-operating district, they'd have every permutation possible. The structural stumbling block was, in addition to a secondary union, 7 through 12, they had an elementary middle union, Lakeview, and it had Greensboro and Stannard, Greensboro belonging to Hazen Union, Stannard having choice. Stannard was, by the end, clearly determined that it did not want a change in the status quo. By statute, it requires the consent of both parties to dissolve a union. The reason I've been invited, I'd worked with their attorney, Chris Leopold, in what we thought might work as a way of allowing Greensboro to affirm its interest in the modified unified union and then continue in it just grade 7 and still stay. It was very complicated, and they recognized it as such, but that's why I was there. Again, if I can be allowed a moment of personal privilege, I've always talked to people when they decided not to vote, or they had a vote and it failed, usually 1 or sometimes 2 districts. This is the first time I'd ever been in the room, and coward that I am, I tried to get out, assuring them that they wanted to privately talk about these final discussion before the vote, and every voice yelled no at the same time. I don't know if they wanted to torture me or if it was an expression of trust, but I knew how it was going to go as they walked in the room. These people had been working for 3 years. They were in utter pain. I'd gotten the frustration the other times. this time, the waves of pain truly came through. I mean, here were people who'd worked very, very hard. They were absolutely convinced that they had something that was going to benefit their communities. Superintendent Canning had talked about the inequities among a number of the local districts. I won't mention the names here, but that clearly some of them were able to offer significantly more opportunities than others, and this would be a way to rectify that. And on the one hand, they still believed that the reasons were there. On the other, they'd been banging their head against the wall for 3 years. And so primarily, and typically everywhere, the impediment has been incorporating choice districts into a larger reform effort. We've seen that happen again and again. It was actually the biggest problem by far in H 883, and they ultimately guaranteed that no choice district would lose any of its choice. It's actually a level of commitment they've never made to any district operating anything else, but it was there. They took their, well, I guess it was technically a vote. I think it's much more fair to say that it was consensus. I tried to offer a little bit of encouragement that every case I knew of, these studies produced inner cooperation from the cross-pollination, and that people looked upon them as having a positive impact. And Superintendent Canning went through a list of things that had already emerged from their study. And I'm happy to tell you that the special education at the SU level is so efficient that they're returning money to their districts. But the bottom line was that they were convinced, and I suspect rightly convinced, that they would not meet the requirements for unanimity for vote, and they will be writing a report, and it will be submitted.
Okay. Two things before you get into your other report. When, in February, I guess, when we agreed to support the secretary and not pursue some of the boundary studies, was that set to a time based on the pending legislation, or was that a final decision?
You've made, my recollection is you made it optional for them. They are not required to do anything,
All right.
which actually extends, it removed the deadlines and allows them more time to to pursue options.
All right. This is maybe an unfair question, and maybe more to set up a conversation for the June meeting. If this board was to, I'm only speaking for myself, obviously, if this board was to pursue governance in the next few months, are there, given an existing statute, are there ways that this board could look at that issue?
The largest, my sense is this board has been as flexible on waivers on the use of its authority as it can be under present law. It's hard for me to imagine anything else that you could do, and I have given it thought.
Well, I think one thing is the criteria by which districts are asked to consider this. I mean, right now, when a superintendent retires, this conversation begins. So I think that it could be, for example, there's a district in the south of the state that's had 6 superintendents or something like that in 5 years. There are districts that are really struggling, and it could be that we came up with a different set of criteria that would trigger a review.
Well, the way I would leave this then is if the agency has some suggestions for this board to consider over the next few months, knowing that there's probably going to be further legislation, I would invite you to bring that back to us at the June meeting.
We can do that, sir.
Okay? Now on to your last topic.
The last one will be very brief. The information is in front of you. It was a product of a group of superintendents Superintendent Biljashik felt unable to sign because his supervisory union board is against the dissolution, the dispersal of the districts. Basically, Pittsford goes to Windsor Central in their proposal. They'd already been engaged in discussions before this started. In fact, Pittsford was frustrated that the larger discussion delayed its hopes to move to Windsor Central. All other 5 in this, or all the other districts in this letter are recommended to go to the Orange-Windsor Supervisory Union. And the only thing not in the letter itself, which is, I think now public knowledge, is that Superintendent Bickford, who generously accepted the district's retires June 30th. That, as the chair pointed out, the discussion part of this should occur next week in a warned meeting with parties present. If there's anything.
So is this, I mean, again, I need to look at the geography and look at, is this a solution, or is this still up in the air?
Clearly, this is a statement of a position rather than a report. There's no evidence of the analysis that went into it, except that the allocation of choice districts corresponds with where the largest number of their students went. The information they had from Mr. Andrews' report would have given them a fairly good approximation of how money would flow. And I know they've thought about issues such as the closing out of the Windsor Northwest Supervisory Union. So I know that these few pages are not representative of the range of their discussions. But this obviously is not another equivalent or approximation even of the studies that the board typically gets when it makes these decisions. We'll obviously provide maps and can give a bit more detail on the finances that's not in here that we'll be able to know. Ultimately, whether that's adequate or not is a decision of the board.
Any other general, yes,
Rebecca?
Margaret?
The other thing, we
Oh, excuse
we do have some internal numbers on allocation of title money that we would
Yes.
present at the next meeting as well.
And that will be included in
Because
the,
the realignment will shape who is eligible for some of that.
And you will make sure that you invite the proper people to testify or appear before us next meeting. Margaret?
I'd like to raise a choice issue that's related to the public schools, and it's one that I know how it plays out some places, but I don't know how it plays out all places, and I think it's perhaps important to consider. And that's in the curriculum coordination aspects. So, for example, and this is an example I know well, there may be many other examples. In Peacham, for example, the students have choice after 6th grade, and they choose a variety of schools beyond Peacham. Percentage-wise, a very small number choose an in-district choice. So Peacham also is multi-age, so has historically had multi-age rotating curriculum, A-B years, that kind of thing. Due to the curriculum coordination requirements in Act 153, 156, they are now doing curriculum coordination as a district, which would be fine.
you mean as a supervisory?
Yes, as a supervisory district. So whereas none of the other schools in the district have choice at that grade level, and also, they also don't have multi-age curriculum. So whereas they used to be able to develop multi-age curriculum in-house, pretty in a timely way, now the 3 teachers, and there are only 3 teachers, are on district curriculum committees which meet monthly, which require time out of school and substitutes, and which take extensive periods of time to develop the curriculum, like 2 years maybe. And then the curriculum doesn't fit the school, and the students aren't necessarily, the need for alignment K-12 isn't there because they're not in a K-12 system. So I think that's an issue of choice districts, public school issue of choice districts beyond do they have choice or not. I think there are systems issues that impact the schools who have choice as regards coordination. And I wonder how extensive that is and who that impacts and who it doesn't, because it looks differently throughout the state. It makes the choice schools more inefficient, and it's costly in terms of time to be in that. You see what I mean?
I
Yeah.
understand what
Yeah.
you mean. The rotation is not something I've thought about at all, and I apologize.
Yeah.
Every supervisory union that has choice comes up with that problem. They're still very
Right.
clearly in a process of transition. One assumes as they move through it,
Right.
they will continue. The other obligation is the choice district has a responsibility of monitoring the places where students are choosing. There have always been special challenges coordinating curriculum outside of pre-K-12
Yes.
because you have students
Yeah.
spreading out.
Right.
I think that they're in different places.
I think it's really specific to the school, and partly it's a function of the capacity of the school to communicate, to be blunt. I mean, there are many multi-ages where they have a rotating curriculum like that, and, you know, even the whole premise of multi-age is that you have a range of ability anyway, so that you could have 2 grades that you cover in a 2-year span, and you're assuming that you have variability of ability, performance, or demonstrated capacity in there anyway. So you're just using in alternate years a different set of, curriculum guidelines, and that's how many people do it. So it's not really a redundancy, it's just that you're focusing on what the district calls 5th grade one year, and you're focusing on what the district calls 6th grade the next year. I think it's just how the school works with the district to make that work.
Yeah, it does.
And I think it's hard. I would challenge the other piece, because there's so much good research showing about, and lived it in my own school. Even, I understand the 6 through 12 piece, but at the K through 6 piece, there is virtue in having some kind of coordinated plan. Otherwise, they do dinosaurs every year. And so there is virtue in having some intentional planning
Right,
around that.
but in some cases, the intentional plan could be more creative and innovative if it wasn't necessarily aligned with something that doesn't necessarily have relevance beyond 6th grade. Yeah, yeah.
And I
It
think that's a
depends on the
local
flexibility
communication issue. I think
district-wide.
it's it's funny, I mean, I talked to an educator, and she called it the puddles you play in. The world is so rich, and every subject is so rich. It's really, the art of teaching is really what you do within the puddle that you're playing
Right,
in.
and with the standards being so clearly articulated now, that's the framework you're working with.
Right.
So the level of coordination of, are we doing life cycles through frogs or butterflies is really not as necessary.
But what I'm hearing from teachers, and what I hear from superintendents and curriculum coordinators across the state, is more along the lines of, I don't have time to develop all this curriculum. I want to focus on how I teach and provide engaging and exciting instruction. And if I have to spend all my time writing curriculum, I never get to the how.
Well, that would
And so
be
that's the
great.
trade-off that people are making, and I
Yeah.
think if a district is perseverating endlessly on the writing of the curriculum, that's a problem. What I see is many districts that are trying to write jointly so that they can focus on the how in the context of their own school. So I think we can't mandate that, but I hope that we can encourage schools to do that.
That would be
Other-
promising.
Yeah.
Other general questions on this issue? Comments? So we will have a position of the agency as we approach this issue in June?
Yes, sir.
On this particular, yes.
Okay, thank you. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. We could take action on the, I assume there's any other comments on the legislative session? I think we covered that before, but if people still have comments?
We can go look at Lachlan's locker.
Right. Can we take action on the, yes, go ahead.
Before the retreat, could we ask Rebecca or form some kind of thing to list the issues on which we might want to take positions as conceptual pieces? It'd be good to be working off of something to frame your discussion.
Does it make sense to have a preliminary conversation where the board talks about what they want to know or what they're motivated by, and we could try to massage that?
I guess I'm malleable. I would just like a structured process of some sort to guide us through.
I don't want to steal Carol's thunder, but she's been doing a tremendous amount of work around looking at the board priorities and the board strategic plan and mapping some of the work that's been done to the priorities you've already outlined. And there are some places where I think we've seen a lot of progress, but there are also some places where there really hasn't been much. And maybe that's another way to frame it as well.
Mm-hmm. Why don't you bring that point up this afternoon when we're under
Okay.
Item K. In the interest of time, why don't we take action on the consent agenda if people are comfortable with that?
So moved.
Been moved by Bill, seconded by Lachlan. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. The consent agenda has been approved.
I had one clarifying question. On the minutes, which I don't have in front of me, how many years did we vote for the virtual school?
3.
Was it 3?
5 to 3.
It was 3?
Yeah, we reduced it from 5 to 3, I believe.
Okay.
And if you have substantive concerns, you can, as my understanding is that you have the.
No, I thought that there was just so much debate about the 1, 3, 2 in a review. I just wanted to make sure, because I couldn't remember when I read the minutes. Okay,
Well,
sorry.
you want to take a minute to check that, or are you comfortable?
No, if the board remembers 3, at that
Well,
point.
but we want to make sure it's reflected in the minutes accurately. That's what you're.
It is, that's what it says.
okay.
It says 3.
All right, so let me call the motion again. All those in favor of the consent agenda say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the consent agenda has been approved, and we will be in recess till, we may get back here at 1 o'clock? Yeah. We'll reconvene at 1 o'clock. Education back to order. Had a great lunch, and our first order of business is a presentation by Rebecca, Balanced Accountability Model. I think it's going to be on the screen, so maybe we ought to move ourselves to the audience
Sure.
section.
Yeah,
Okay.
over there.
We'll find room. You don't have to move.
Yes. It helps Scott.
Let's have some order here.
All right, I'm just waiting. This feels ridiculous and formal. What I'd like to do is pull together just some, I've got a host of emails from a lot of you separately, so I'm trying to respond generally to some of those in this little presentation. What I thought I'd do is give you some insight into some of the data that we're working with that's going to form some of our thinking recently, and then tie it into both some of the work we're doing about accountability and some of the kinds of research we'd like to do moving forward to just look at governance, so that wherever we end up in the fall, hopefully it's a little bit more informed as we move forward. So with that, there were some shifts implicit in the EQS that I wanted to just call out because they're also pretty integral to the work that we're doing at the agency right now. And the first is moving away from compliance to support. A belief that helping schools get better and helping teachers become more effective as teachers and helping students learn more effectively isn't about just checking off of the box that people have done these things. It's providing them with opportunities to take risks, work together professionally, and get appropriate support so that they can achieve the shared goals that we have. The other underlying implicit assumption or shift is that we're moving from ranking and sorting to continuous growth and improvement. Labeling schools based on their overall student performance in a flat way is just basically telling us the proportion of students that the school serves that are coming and living in poverty currently. And that's pretty predictive. And then when we really want to talk about schools and improvement and getting better, what we need to do is focus on continuous growth and improvement. That's what this is, our game is about. And then the last is we're moving from measuring up, just how well did you do, towards also looking at whether we provided schools and children and teachers with the supports and the opportunities that they need to be able to realize their ambitious goals. And as I said earlier, if there's one lesson of No Child Left Behind, it's pretty much that having high stakes for teachers is making a bunch of faulty assumptions that really time and experience hasn't borne out. It's not that people don't care, they are deeply motivated. It's that we need a different set of tools and a different strategy to actually help us realize our ambitious goals for kids. And I've never heard a teacher in Vermont say they weren't committed to closing opportunity and achievement gaps and that they weren't committed to trying to help improve learning overall. It's just that somehow we don't have the tools and the knowledge yet on how to do it as effectively as we'd like. So, I just wanted to introduce to you one panel of data to sort of frame the conversation a little bit. This is a panel from our 7th grade reading results, and it's disaggregated by gender and family income. And I could have picked any panel of our statewide data because they're pretty much the same trend. There's some slight variation, but this is pretty much the picture you see. When you look at this, the top line is female students who are not eligible for free and reduced lunch. The next line, which tracks, the next two lines track together, and that's basically males who are not eligible for free and reduced lunch and performance overall. So males who are not eligible for free and reduced lunch track the average. And then the next line, the second from the bottom, is females eligible for free and reduced lunch, and the bottom line is the boys who are not eligible, who are eligible for free and reduced lunch. What do you notice when you look at this data?
I could have told you that based on where the lines are placed.
Okay, so
I could have pretty much guessed.
and pretty much your teachers would have said the same thing. They know that. So one, we knew this. So I think we all feel an impulse, and certainly the education quality standards say we need to deal with this.
But did your math scores show the same pattern?
A little different. We're seeing some mostly similar
I would
patterns.
expect it to be.
Girls tend to outperform. I can give those to you. I can get those. We chose these because this is what I had available, because when we were presenting the kneecaps, we were trying to move people from just looking at performance levels to scale scores. But I'll get them. But we do see these patterns generally. And it is generally our low-income boys who do not demonstrate the gains that we like.
What happened in 2008? Looks like everybody went up a little bit.
It's hard to know.
It's 3-year cycles, though.
It could be 3-year cycles. It could be slight fluctuations in the test groups or the test itself. There might be slight changes in format that yield sort of just noise. I think the overall trend, what jumped out at me is, first of all, we haven't really narrowed any gaps, and we haven't really generated gains overall. So whatever accountability system we've been laboring under, it's making us feel bad, but it isn't getting us where we need to go. So that's just something I would just throw out there. And that I think this still also sort of acknowledges some of the virtue of standardized tests. And I'm not going to say that they measure everything that's important or tell us everything we need to know, but this is one way we do get a sense or a snapshot into differences in opportunities and achievement, because of different background situations, perhaps. And this one, in our case, one of the things that's easier to pull out is this interaction of gender and poverty. Our race scores are complicated because we have such small representation in some schools, and it is, it's the groups, the subgroups within them are so diverse. It's difficult to get clear measures on what's actually going on. For example, in one school, the African American population might be predominantly second language learning Somalis. In another school, they might be Native born Americans, and that's going to have a different manifestation just because of English language needs in one setting and not another. So that's that. And then the other piece I'll throw out, I just thought this was interesting because Governor Shumlin called it out as well. One of the things that we also know is that one of Vermont's best exports, I think it's worth calling out, is our highly educated students. We do a very good job with.
You know when you're doing it, but you tap your foot and the microphone stays.
Okay. Take my shoes off. There you go. Is that on camera? So one of our best exports as a state is actually our highly educated students. And we send many of our students, particularly our highest performing students, out of state. And one of the challenges we have is they don't come back to Vermont. So when you start to think about the economic future of our state, when you think about the net export of students, that's a problem. And then the other reality that raises for us is, are we sufficiently educating the students who stay here so that they're able to sustain our economic viability in future? So keep going. So just wanted to throw out hypothetically as a board, when we talk about education quality, for me, it's also linked to economic sustainability. And we saw 36 budgets go down this year. We anticipate that we'll see more budgets go down next year. And as budgets begin to go down and this tension of economic sustainability begins to take hold, what we see is schools making very, very hard choices that adversely impact teachers and students and the quality of the learning that can take place in those environments. So we're very worried about that, and we really see education quality as linked to economic sustainability in those towns. So some of the issues that we've been talking about are the number of students who are trained for jobs that are available. Is there an alignment between what we're preparing our students to be able to do and the kinds of opportunities that will be available for them in our community? And I've already talked to many of you about the way technology, for example, is transforming the workplace. It is also transforming school and the way we do school, but inconsistently across the state. And that's a challenge because many of the students, if they don't have the kinds of 21st century skills that you acknowledged in your education quality standards, that might have worked for them 25 years ago. It probably will not work for them moving forward. We really have to rise to this challenge of providing equitable opportunities for all kids. Skipping down a bit, we are looking at the proportion of voters who are working, the proportion of voters with children in the schools, and the fact that Vermont is an aging state. One of the things I keep hearing all the time is, well, we need to increase the transfer from the general fund to the ed fund. Our general fund is going to decline because as we have an aging population and people begin to retire, we are not going to have the capacity to generate those revenues the way we had in the past. And so we're mindful of that and thinking about what that means for the future of our schools. And then other sustainability issues that are real. We have, after 17 years of uninterrupted declines in enrollment, we serve about 20% fewer students than we did 20 years ago. That has not been consistent across the state. There are communities, Arlington's seen increases in enrollment, Burlington is seeing increases in enrollment, Stowe's increasing in enrollment, Norwich on the east side of the state is seeing increases in enrollment. Think about what those communities have in common, and think about where we've seen the greatest declines. There is a migration of population within the state that is going to have implications for how we do school, whether we experience it now or we experience it in 10 years. And part of it will be, as a state, how do we strategically respond to that in a way, again, that preserves this equity of opportunity for kids that's so, so important to us. And then there's this last reality. I spoke a bit this morning about the special ed modified block grant, but we have seen in our own data between fiscal year 90 and fiscal year 13, a 97% increase in full-time special education professional staff, 178% increase in special education aides, and a trivial increase in the number of students that we serve who have identified disabilities. That's not sustainable, and we have a compelling obligation to make sure every child receives the opportunities that we can provide them. But we also have to ask ourselves, is the way we're going about this the way that's going to best create opportunities for kids, and also is it economically sustainable? And certainly my concern, I've been fairly transparent about it, is the reliance on one-on-one paraprofessionals sometimes, I think, precludes some children in some situations from getting access to a highly qualified teacher. And that's something we're working hard on to try to incentivize some change.
Second question?
Yep.
Is there any, that was from 1990 to 2013, is that right?
Yep.
So is there any difference in terms of how the classroom environment has changed or what the expectations are that might make that?
Well, there are in terms of our children more difficult than they were. I mean, there are changes. There are
children who are now deemed should we having behavior problems because the classroom environment is becoming less and less flexible?
So partly it's environment, but partly it's also, I mean, there's a number of factors, and I don't think we really know which ones are driving it. I mean, I was talking to someone at UVM who was talking about the proportion of babies born in Vermont now who are born to opiate-addicted mothers, which means the babies are opiate-addicted when they're born. We expect that in 5 years, the effect of that will be in our schools. We know that we now know from public safety, and one of the things we're looking for from public safety are leading indicators, because we know from some of our experience in other communities that when we see an uptick in domestic violence reports and certain kinds of criminal reports, we are followed 5 years later in the school by an increase in behavioral incidents. So we are seeing that there are patterns around that. We also know that improved medical technology has meant that there are children in schools now who would not have been in schools 20 years ago. So there are changing things. The reality is it may be more costly, more complicated. We also know more, and there are, I think because we know about the plasticity of the brain, for example, we also have a sense of potential that we didn't have perhaps 25 years. So where we might have just put someone off in a resource room 25 years ago and said, forget it, I think we now know that many more kids than we ever thought was possible actually can be supported and learn to levels where they're able to live meaningful lives and support and work in their communities. So I think we have that sense of obligation too. That's, again, your role as a board is to look across the state, step back to 30,000 feet, and ask is there a way to support this so that we get good outcomes for kids, but in a sustainable way. The other thing we're struck by at the state level is what we do see is differing opportunities to learn. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of that because they're worth noting, because when you think about the charge of Brigham, we had Brigham 1 in terms of increased equity and inputs. We still haven't had sort of our Brigham 2 moment where we look at what we're getting for what we buy. And what we still see across the state is that when you're in one town versus another town, there's very different opportunities for you as you come through school. Some of them are quantifiable easily, some of them aren't. And we'll be fully transparent about that. But the data we have doesn't fully let us get at that right now. Hopefully when we get to education quality reviews, we will. So these are 2 middle schools. This is SEC data. This was reported to us by the school, so this is their listing of courses. And I offer this as an example. These 2 middle schools both feed into the same high school. And this was brought to my attention by a superintendent who was talking about the different opportunities that kids get in different schools that feed into his one program. And just to offer it as, to reflect on, what you see in one school is much more elaborate opportunities around concert band, chorus, and music electives. They're not coming to school for math. And so there's a very different kind of experience if you're in school B that doesn't have any of those options. Similarly, school A is starting, where is it?
Language?
Foreign language.
What are sections? What does that mean?
It's how many sections of the course they have. So they might have,
okay, yeah.
so they have, so for example, school A has 7 sections in all of math, and one of them is algebra. And the other school has only 2 sections in math. But you get a sense of some of the differences. Oh, and they offer French. And so the issue is when these kids come into the same program at the high school, some of these kids are starting behind. And that is 2 issues. When you talk about people feeling like you're strong and you're with your peers, the kids from the smaller school are not starting at the same level as the bulk of their peers. And that's an interesting position to be in, particularly when you're sort of a minority population in that school. The other issue is it creates cost because it has implications at the high school level for how you staff to make sure that those kids have access to language opportunities, because you have to offer more introductory level courses than you might have in a different setting, potentially. And that's the way the superintendent posed it to me. So it does create different options and choices. And then the next one. And then the other issue is just sort of the value for dollars. And one of the things the legislature keeps asking us is, well, what's the ROI? What's the return on investment? And I don't need to tell this group how difficult it is to answer a question like that, because so much of what's powerful about a school is very difficult to measure. And that's why when we talk about balanced accountability, we'll talk about some of the more qualitative measures that are important as well. But just to give you one example, particularly look at schools C and D. These are 2 schools that pay about the same amount per pupil. School D, the one in the middle, actually pays a tiny bit more. They have very similar homestead tax rates. You can see they have a huge difference in per capita income in those 2 towns. The town on the left is much wealthier. So even though they've got the same tax rate, the one on the left has more resources behind it. And that's a very simplistic way of presenting it, but that's true, trust me. I'm not giving you the name because it doesn't matter, because we could have picked a number of schools to make this argument. Keep going. So here's what you get. Here's what you get for that same tax rate and that similar per pupil expenditure. What you see is a lot more depth in one of the schools. And the one I would just pull out is if you pull out School D. What you don't see there is, what you see there, the most advanced course that they report is junior math, and they're not calling it pre-calculus. Now, but just think about what the implications are for post-secondary options for kids who come out of School D versus School C. Just food for thought. Next one. Same thing in science for the kids who are, fanatical science fans. Very different opportunities in school, spending the same amount, same tax burden. One of the goals of this board was really educating students for citizenship, to participate in civic life in their communities in an informed, engaged, and educated way. There's a lot that could be happening in those courses that we don't know about just by looking at their course names. I want to be totally transparent about that. But you got 3 years to engage in it if that's your passion. And it's certainly less breadth and depth and choice for students in terms of what they're interested in than you see in the first school. Okay. Again, think about School D when these kids are applying to college. That's the farthest you can go in that campus. And then arts. For so many kids who we know come for a variety of reasons to school, there's just more specialization on the one side than in some of the others. And so that affects the kind of opportunities students have for individualizing and personalizing their path through high school. The other challenge we deal with in the state is this whole issue of meaningful data. And we are a test-based accountability system currently, because this is the only statewide metric we have to really compare and evaluate schools. And what you see here is, this is an 8th grade science report from the Lowell graded school. Some of you may have seen this. I've actually looked at some of your schools, and some of you are getting score reports like this now in your own areas, which is no data. We cannot release the data for these students because to do so would be personally identifying students because the numbers are so small. And historically, we have been reporting 3rd through 8th grade data together, and I will talk to you about why that's problematic. But if you think about it just from a mathematical point of view, the only way we've been able to give a lot of our elementary schools data is by averaging percent proficient across grades 3 through 8. And if you think about the readings you did for this meeting, you cannot average averages across grade levels for a whole bunch of reasons. It just shouldn't be done, and we should not do it moving forward. But it's also creating some false comparisons. So for example, a middle school that has only 7th and 8th grade is thrown into the same pool as an elementary school that has grades 3 through 5. And I can tell you, when you look at the distribution of the test takers against the cut scores, some of our tests are much harder than others. So if you're ranking people based on those average scores, and one school's including the harder grades and another one isn't, you've already leveled, sort of stacked the deck a bit. It just isn't a meaningful indicator. But to get away from that, we're going to have to increase the number of schools that get reports like this, which effectively means they have no accountability data at all. Another serious limitation with test-based accountability in Vermont. And in some cases, we also have lack of meaningful data about performance. When the power of test data is to give you some indication of performance over time. And if you've been in a small school, and many of us have, you know that it's a tricky thing because classes are different. They have different personalities. The composition is different. You have different students. Maybe 3 students move in who are less well prepared, and it will skew your grades. This is the distribution of test scores, the mean score for schools for the 11th grade math test. And on the left-hand axis, the y-axis, is the average scale score. Across the bottom is the number of students in the school. And what you see is that funnel shape. And what that reflects is that the scores are much more reliable. The mean scores are much more stable the larger the number of students you have, because those sort of random issues get washed out over the number of students. And what you see on the left-hand side with the very small schools is a lot of variability, but also volatility. What we see is schools that are in the lowest proportion, lowest part, in one year may be top scorers the next year, just because of who happens to be moving through a particular grade. So it's very difficult to talk about continuous improvement of learning in a context like that when the bounce you're getting is going to drown out any signal of the effect of your curriculum, your teaching. And this is another example of why at the agency, and I know this board as well, we've taken such a strong stand against evaluating teachers based on test scores. Because it would not be fair. It just wouldn't be fair to teachers in these contexts to do that. I threw this in. This is just a slide that really struck me from a presentation by Andreas Schleicher, who presented at a conference. He works with a PISA assessment. And one of the things that he talks about is this complex relationship between policies and performance. And in particular, this issue of systems with more accountability. He defined it as systems that have clear goals and clear accountability for who's doing it. Schools with more autonomy do better. So these are schools with what I would call local control do better than schools with less local control. When you have clear goals and clear accountability about who achieves those goals. But when it's not clear that you have accountability, and it's not clear about who's responsible for goals, in that case, schools with more autonomy tend to do worse and you get more variability, and schools with less autonomy do better. So that's just want to throw that out there, because if we have a system where it's not clear who's responsible, K through 12, and it's not clear what our outcomes are, how do we have a statewide conversation about quality and about how to ensure quality for all kids? And that's really, I think, the challenge that we have, and that's really the challenge of the education quality reviews, is to take the education quality standards that this board has put together and try to figure out how to gather systematic data that ensures that every school is getting high quality feedback, knowing that every measure is fallible, that we can use to try to think in a systematic way about how to help all students learn and how to help all teachers become more effective. So that brings us to the education quality reviews. I'm just going to give you a brief view, because I think some of this you've already seen, and I encourage you, if you have a chance, I know Chris Case has been going around the state, and certainly we heard about that this morning, and presenting this to superintendents and principals, and getting some preliminary feedback that we can use to do some of this work. The education quality review will bring, it will bring distinguished independent experts, representatives of the Agency of Education, from the representatives of the professional standards boards, practicing educators, and community members to each school to review the school's work with respect to the education quality standards, as well as available evidence of student learning and the supports for learning the school provides. It's a chance to have many parties who are deeply invested in education and in improving learning come as critical friends to provide high quality feedback to schools. It's not about high stakes hiring and firing, it's about focusing on how we help support improvement. What are the sources of evidence? Performance tests of proficiency. That was mentioned today in the context of the PLP work. We are working closely with the League of Innovative Schools and also with David Roof's outfit, and we're trying to figure out how to put together a set of performance tasks on a platform that would help teachers really score their work against samples online to support that work so that they can effectively calibrate. And what they've found through some of their work is that they can get much higher reliability in scoring than we were able to get through the portfolio project by having teachers score work to other work samples as opposed to a rubric. So that's very promising. It's pretty experimental, but we're pretty excited about the direction of the work. And one of the things that we like about it is it's actually building heavily on work that's already in place and already taking place in Vermont schools. And it's really trying to take that to the next level. Yep.
Using the National Task Bank?
The what?
The National Task Bank?
It could, I'm sure it could, yeah. Then the other piece that we would hope people would review is locally developed assessments and student portfolios, and I'm going to include here also the student learning objectives, which is something that's being heavily supported actually by the NEA, and Martha at some point will probably speak to that. But it's the only reason we haven't put it up higher is because this is still under development, and I don't think you expect it to be done until 2019, if I'm correct. But that we're hoping will become a good piece of this work in the local arena soon. Another piece that we think is absolutely critical is surveys of students, parents, and educators. I went through the board's objectives and your strategic plan and was struck again and again by the emphasis that you had on putting in student voice. We don't systematically ask students about their experience in schools. We don't ask them about the school climate and the culture and how that shapes their experience in learning. We don't ask them about self-directed learning and opportunities to to problem solve and make mistakes. These are things that this board has articulated are critically important in education quality standards, but we don't currently have a way of assessing that. But I was actually at the Learning in Place conference talking to a young boy, he must have been 7th grade, and he was talking about what questions I should ask on a survey. And the one thing he said, it was wonderful, I want to hire him. He said, well, you should ask us, do you have opportunities in school to direct your own learning and figure out how to solve problems by yourself? I thought that was just brilliant from a 7th grader, and they know it. They really do know it, and we don't have a way to capture that. But if we could develop some surveys, pull off of some of the nationally developed surveys that are used for research purposes, that are in the public domain, we would both have the ability to give teachers and educators and families high-quality feedback, but we would also be able to do research about what particular teacher practices were most effective in yielding those results so that teachers can disseminate those across school sites. And also parents and educators. And I know in the school, from the school side, it's sometimes terrifying to survey parents, but I have to say I've always found that, but for the one person you knew was going to write what they wrote anyway, I find that generally it's very specific and it's actionable. And just the fact that you've asked parents and community members for feedback is such a powerful thing, and it builds such goodwill. So I think I hope that would be a successful and positive experience for others. A review of the structures and supports in place to support Act 77. I mentioned earlier that we're rolling out the Naviance system and trying to make that very affordable and widely available to support some of this work. But as several members mentioned this morning, we can't evaluate schools without evaluating the opportunities and the supports that are available to help the kids learn. And when you think about the access to universal pre-K, which is now out there, we expect that to make some results. If there are districts that aren't embracing that challenge, we would expect that to show up in their data. We could begin to show patterns and perhaps also direct some of our state resources, particularly around things like extended day or extended year towards places that really seem to need those opportunities the most. And then there are other possible examples, and this is far from development. I know, Margaret, you wanted me to tell you who's in compliance with EQS. We're going to be several years off because I think robust work that involves field feedback, we need to incorporate practitioners in developing these tools. So it's going to take us a while to get there, but these are some of the other things that have come out of the conversations that we've been having. Video clips, we have to look at standardized test scores, and then observations from classroom walkthroughs or instructional rounds. Not just descriptive documentation of what's going on so that people can have that rich data to work from. And then interviews with teachers and students as well. This is just a rough budget of what we're working on. I can see my columns are getting all messed up. But first, for development and piloting, and these are years 1, years 2s from whenever we start the work. I don't know, we're going to get to this as we get to this. But we see piloting the educational quality reviews as something that's worthy of a lot of professional development. We see it actually being an incredibly powerful tool for professional development for educators in the field, the chance to go across school sites and learn from your peers and exchange in deep and meaningful conversations with peers. And so we want to make sure that we do it in a robust way that's supportive and provides people with opportunities for professional development. In terms of implementation of education quality reviews, we would expect to need to be able to compensate people to provide that work. It shouldn't be off of their own wallet. And we would need to have support. And for distinguished educators, we're thinking of retired teachers or retired administrators who might want to come back and do some of this work. Next. And then in terms of assessing the student proficiency task, we see this setting up the platform, the software design site setup, as probably one of the most expensive things that we would have to take on. But to have a robust performance-based assessment of proficiency, we have to support it or it won't be a meaningful tool. And I think that if you've ever been involved in that kind of calibration training, one of the most powerful pieces in sort of understanding your students' work and thinking about how to push your students' work to the next level is being able to sit down with other educators and talk about what you see in the work before you. So we see this as another opportunity both to support it online through work samples online, but also in terms of professional development to provide ample professional development, hopefully for teachers, so that they can sit down and sit with their colleagues and talk about the work and talk about what constitutes good work together. And then the final piece is just the climate school surveys. Whether or not it costs what's posed here, we think we actually can bring it down, but part of it's a function of what we're able to do with staffing in-house in the agency. To support all this work, the other piece we need to do is bring in more. We do need more staff, that's a reality. And one of the things that we've lobbied for very, very hard is another person to come in at the exempt level. The administration has given us one more position for someone to be in charge of educator quality. And the purpose of that person would be to really just support teachers and learners and try to figure out how to coordinate all of our initiatives around improvement of learning. And hopefully also they would be able to sustain some of the work that we've currently started around development of principals to provide better feedback to teachers so that teachers can get better. So one of the things that we're doing is we're contracting with some local consultants to provide training, professional development for administrators and some teachers from schools in using a modified version of the Danielson framework so that everyone has access to standards-based feedback. And we would like to be able to continue that kind of support using sort of a scale-up or train-the-trainer model down the road as well. It's hard to talk about any of this without talking about governance, so I wanted to at least nod to some of the kinds of things that we're doing in the context of the current governance conversation. One of the things that we struggled with in the context of the current debate is that there wasn't a lot of good data on some of the factors that were really being discussed. We have some anecdotal hypotheses based on patterns we see. What no one's done yet is test them in a statistical model, and you need to actually fit them out. You can't look at the flat data because you need to model to reflect different kinds of relationships and different other factors that might shape outcomes. And so the two that keep coming up in the context of governance are this whole issue of school size and then the continuity K-12, whether those two factors have an impact. We have hypotheses about these based on what we've seen, but we haven't tested them, and we need to test them in a robust and fair way. And we may end up having to contract out. We have people who could do this work in the agency. I'm not sure we have people with time. So what we may do is contract out with the Center of Assessment or something similar to do some research around what is the relationship between students expected. I just picked kneecap math because that's usually one way. Most parents read to their children. Most parents aren't systematically doing math, though many do tutoring in other communities, some communities. But what's the relationship between students' test scores and governance of the district that they come in, to see if there's any relationship? What's the relationship between scores and whether they operate a continuous K-12 system? What we have seen in some places is anecdotally that when there is disruption, it sometimes does suppress learning. So we want to see if that actually holds across the state. And then what is the effect of being a very small high school on outcomes? We probably also have to do the same for elementary schools. We actually think you'll find different results at different levels. It's not going to be uniform. So we need to look at elementary separately from high school based on just some of our preliminary analysis of the descriptive data. And what's the relationship between per pupil expenditure or per pupil expenditure on administration and the governance of the district the student is in? And that may be technically challenging because trying to figure out what is administration and what is the per pupil expenditure. There are many, many different ways to count that, whether you're counting the phantom students, whether you're counting the small schools grants, whether you're counting all the title money that is apportioned, but not apportioned consistently across districts because of the way Title I operates. It becomes very difficult. So with all those caveats, we'll probably have to fit this several different ways to get a good story. And what is the relationship between those, again, and tax rates and district size? PP and tax rates and district size. And so the strategy is to fit some kind of statistical models that control for the effects of race, English language learner status, incidence of poverty, and what we're calling ruralicity, how rural your school is, because we do think that that is, in the context of Vermont, a factor that, that affects us. This is very preliminary. This is not fleshed out. We are a ways from having a robust charge, and we also welcome any feedback or input before we design it, or as we're designing it, to make sure that it's a robust.
So you're thinking that the agency would do this in the next few months?
I think we'd like to start it, and again, it partly depends on the availability of someone like the Center for Assessment to do some of this work. Yep.
Another independent variable to go in there is mother's educational attainment.
And the problem is, do we have access to that data?
Yeah.
It's a hard one. Yeah, you're right.
Far stronger than poverty.
It is.
As a predictor.
It is. I talked to a principal in Los Angeles once who said, my poor kids aren't the poor kids in that town because mine are all graduate students in university and they just have temporarily low incomes. They're multi-generational. I think that's, or recent immigrants who are highly educated. They're just recent immigrants.
And
So
the
it's a
other
real
question
issue.
I wanted to ask, if you were going back to the qualitative review, the EQ are, that looks a lot to me like a New England Association of Schools and Colleges review, at least in the independent schools context.
I think elements of it would be very similar.
And those reviews are being done on public schools now, are they not? Do you
But
have
not-
access to them?
But on high schools, not, we would do this at the
Yeah. Oh,
elementary
okay.
level as well. We're proposing, and it's sort of like the public school approval reviews, but we're saying everyone. And one of the things is, that's a little different in the public school sector is right now, the only schools that get what we call the hard touch are the ones that are identified under No Child Left Behind as problematic schools. And what we're saying is that everyone should be eligible for review and for continuous support to get better.
Can you get outside data from the New England Association of Schools and Colleges? So, for example, can you compare Maine to Vermont?
Oh, we probably could, but it would, yes. We also could have, I mean, my assumption is if a school was doing the ask here, they might want to use some of that data for the education quality review. We certainly are not trying to duplicate, because schools have enough to do. Yeah.
Do you know what year that public school approval process stopped?
I don't, probably when they took the division out. Do you know, Vaughn? Where are you?
I
Carol
know
might
that
know.
was based on, prior public school approval standards, not so much educational quality standards, and it was written, inputs, like you have a librarian at 0.5 if you have X number of kids. But it did totally tie to budgeting, because people would say, oh, well, we can't cut that from the budget. We're required to have that, right? We're required to have everything that was in public school approval. And it was pretty easy to point to what was required because it was basic. And I know EQS is a little different, but I think it acted as a check and balance to some extent on resulting opportunity. And
I think that's
because
the-
we haven't had it
right.
for 10 years, I think that's part of the impact.
Right. Well, I think the other piece of it is when you get down to very small proportions, it's very hard when you have a 0.2 foreign language teacher or 0.4 foreign language teacher, it's very hard to hold them.
Well, I'm not supportive of
In
necessarily
the late
having it
90s,
that way.
Karen, yeah.
In the mid-90s, it stopped.
Late
Late
90s.
90s, because the first school quality standards were approved in 2000.
That's right.
So it's been about
That's right.
15 years that we haven't had public school approval, and this is sort of the new equivalent of that, this system you're talking about.
Well, except it's not contingent on approval, it's about systematic
Right,
continuous
right,
feedback and
right,
improvement.
right. It's the same.
And it's a way to
Outside
check.
eyes coming
This is
in.
the aspiration of the education quality standards. Let's see how you're doing. Here's some data you can use to think intentionally about how to improve. And then I mentioned this because several of you had emailed me about this separately, but I just wanted to tell you about some other things that we're doing to follow up on governance internally anyway. One is that we will be working with VSA in particular to survey superintendents, and hopefully with VPA, I haven't finished that, but we are working on some initiatives with VPA around support and development, professional development, including initial certification, working with the CCB and VPA to see if there's a way to support some of that, to support principals. And we're also mapping. We're doing some interesting mapping to try to identify patterns. So we're generating maps of superintendent and principal turnover. It doesn't look like there's a relationship between superintendent and principal turnover. There does seem to be some slight relationship between preliminary, so I won't say it yet, because so preliminary. But, and then we're also looking to collaborate with various stakeholders to develop a handbook for districts that want to pursue voluntary red formation, just to make it easier, recognizing that not everyone is going to do it, but if you do choose to do it, it's an incredibly complicated process, and we might as well make it as easy for districts that want to pursue that as possible. So we met initially already with members of VSBAT, VSA, and the VPA and VSBA, and a number of superintendents and business managers from districts that have done REDs or been involved in RED formations, and we're going to try to draw off the collective expertise of that group to begin to map out sort of a how-to guide so that that districts that want to do this can have that as an option or a support.
Why VSBA?
VSBA just has a tremendous amount of expertise and knowledge around what goes on in schools. They call it risk management because they see what system failure looks like from the insurance side. When you don't have good systems, it manifests itself in lawsuits and problems, and they see it from there. So they can tell you where it's breaking down. And the conversation, and they also work with districts in transition around some of the kinds of policies that they have to develop. So they've been heavily involved in you can correct me, but in every RED formation, they're advising on the kinds of policies and the insurance and liabilities that the district would need to take on or deal with in the process. They actually have a surprising amount of expertise. Anything else? Vaughn on that one?
No, that's right.
Okay.
Isn't there currently a handbook on the red procedure? It's like
No,
20 pages long.
There's a template, and then there's material on grants.
Part of
They
the
will
problem,
be
yeah,
more elaborate ones.
there's a lot of work for districts even prior to deciding. I mean, there's a series of things, legal, sort of political, sort of cultural, community conversation work, economic assessments. There's a whole range of factors that you have to address even prior to leading up to a decision to make a red. And so trying to provide some guide through that process for people you want to consider whether this is the right option, what are the kinds of things you need to think about, so that you can make that decision in an informed way. And then once you make that decision that you want to pursue a red, how do you manage the economic, political, legal, community, considerations in a way that makes it less painful and more smooth and expeditious?
We've learned a lot, and the session was hectic, but it's time to get that down so people moving forward benefit from what everybody's done up to now.
I think the concern we have is that we do see that regardless of what governance happens, my suspicion is that there are some schools that are going to either close or they're going to pursue governance consolidation out of necessity. I mean, we have individual schools in the state, a couple that have 5 or 6 principals in 5 years. They've cut programs, people are leaving, they particularly are finding larger numbers of families tuitioning their kids out. And when you start to get into that cycle, what you lose is the internal voice in your community to sustain your school. And so our concern is that that if we don't make it easy for people to start figuring out a plan B when they hit that point of crisis, that kids will suffer in the interim. So our goal is just to make sure that if districts need to pursue this as an option, that they can do so as smoothly as possible.
And to date, there's only been 2 new reds formed.
1 red formed and 1 consolidated supervisory unit into 2 rivers.
Okay, so
I
that
think
was
there's
what,
the
1
other
page?
thing, yeah. And the other thing we see is there are a number, and the problem we see is that often the districts in crisis are isolated within an SU, so it might be one district that's in what we would call sort of systems failure.
That's a huge problem.
Not happening all at the same time. So there's a school, for example, on the east side of the state that's been looking for a dance partner for 10 years. They can't find anyone who wants to take them, and they're in system failure. So they're now looking across the river at New Hampshire. And it's because schools don't hit that point of crisis at the same time. The districts that are in crisis have very, very limited options.
No, logically, people are reluctant to merge with a district in crisis, which is part of why the larger consolidation into a red was hoped to improve equality. And Rebecca's exactly right. We're seeing these problems across the state with some consistency spread out, but you don't see them forming a critical mass in very many supervisory unions. And when they exist, the first incentive of their immediate neighbors is to back away a little bit rather than to think of ways they can help.
Under current law, does the board have any authority to address that issue?
No, do that. And the piece I don't know about is the secretaries or the board's powers if they came and said, look, we're really, really not in a good situation, and that's going to be a question for an attorney. But in terms of the structural,
I mean, that's really telling, that
It is.
a school district can't find someone to work with them in Vermont, so they're gonna go across the river.
That's not really surprising. I'm thinking of Leicester Superior Dividing, which was searching for a way to find a dance partner within the state. And they really couldn't, and they just came apart, and we're talking across supervisory unions as well. It's a much more difficult issue. Another thing is the latest governance proposals, we're talking about consolidating supervisory unions, but notice this discussion here has been about consolidating schools. And I think
I don't think that's what I was trying to do. That's not what I was trying to talk about.
Well, that's what comes through in the message.
I don't think so. I don't think that was I don't think so. I think also, I think in our own data, we see very individual cases. I think there are schools that are doing very well and they're very cost efficient in our small schools. There are also schools, I think particularly high schools, that are really struggling. I think it's more difficult at the high school level than the elementary level. What we also see is that I don't think it's a coincidence that the SDs tend to have more students living in poverty because it's a more efficient administrative structure, and they've decided the layers of supervision are a luxury they can't afford. I think that for some districts, I talked to numerous people who came in and complained about the cost of the audits, just one that happened over and over again. $9,000 for an audit for a small school. There were 4 other districts in the same SU spending the same amount in audits. If you consolidated governance, you could do one audit for all those schools, and you've just freed up money for professional development, and you might keep your building open. And so the point is, it's really about being intentional and strategic about consolidation of functions that can be consolidated, but being very clear about what your values and goals are in terms of your educational program. I don't think that governance has to follow, the buildings have to follow the governance necessarily.
My point was not to say something against it, but just simply to say, let's put this on the table. I do agree completely that we should consolidate those things that should be consolidated: money, finance, personnel, human resources, curriculum, the list goes on.
You get that statement? Bill's last statement?
Oh, I have said it many times. But I don't think we should shy away from the school issue as well, and we should put that on the table and deal with it on the table. That's all I'm saying.
But the answer to that question might be different in different places as well.
I'm sure it would be.
Rebecca, is it possible to get a copy of your PowerPoint?
Sure. I just have to make sure I saw one editing error. I can't stand it when I do that.
Okay. No, whenever you're ready.
Yes, yes.
No, I just wanted to point
I'll
out.
send it out to the board.
Yeah, in the case of that district who's looking interstate, they're looking interstate, I believe, for educational reasons and balance in terms of offerings and size. So it's a smart decision. It's not necessarily a bad thing that they weren't able to find an in-state partner. They are looking for a partner that will see them as an equal partner rather than a partner who could potentially consume them.
Potentially, well, I think so, except for them, their concern was the only other district they were able to find was a district in crisis on the other side of the river. And so what you now have is 2 districts in crisis joining, whereas their point, the reason they were trying to find a Vermont partner is because there was more stability on the Vermont side of the river. They don't see this, they see this as their last alternative. They don't see it as their first choice.
To emphasize Rebecca's point, H883 was willing to allow supervisory districts, the study committees, to put a lot of assurances in that schools would stay open unless there were, for example, special majorities to close them and things like that. I know, in addition to Rebecca, that Richard, Kate, and Armando felt that more schools would stay open if we could move into larger units, that they could be, in some cases, you might consolidate grades across school. We've got schools operating the same grades that are tiny, and you could walk between them. So you might get those kinds of changes, but they certainly felt that you would ultimately keep more schools open, and the law was set up so that a lot of reassurances could be given to localities that are concerned.
I think the issue, it's just that, the issue is if our goal is what we're calling Brigham 2, which is really ensuring that everybody has access to high quality opportunities to learn, and that the children who need it the most are having access to those opportunities to learn. I think it's hard to have that without having at least touching into the governance conversation at some point. That was what I had them run over.
Great.
I'm sorry.
Great presentation. Thank you very much. And there's obviously some work for us to do there. We're ready to work with you. Has another announcement, not quite such good news.
Yeah, there's a tractor trailer has derailed between exit 4 and exit 5.
Statewide assessment, appropriate use of test scores, something that's very important.
You
Port-
said corporate?
Appropriate.
I thought you said corporate use of test scores.
There is that too, appropriate, but not in this conversation.
Well, with that great introduction, I'm going to turn this part of the meeting over to Bill, in that he has been instrumental in getting this going. So, Bill.
Okay, this follows very appropriately from what Rebecca just put out there. And it deals with assessment, large-scale assessment. And one of the things in my line of work is when I notice the federal rules, laws, and regulations, and I look at the research base behind these kinds of things, and guess what? They're not quite the same. And so school districts are being asked to do all kinds of things that are not necessarily appropriate. And I think it's very important for the state board or any state board to look at these issues and raise questions about them, and also find their own way in a more appropriate way, in a more ethical way in some cases, to do our assessment. And so, somewhat at Rebecca's instigation, and we've talked about this before at some length, I put those 4 readings together for you. Notice they're from professional organizations, they're lay terms, they're short, and they bring the issues out that need to be brought out. And as we think about the future of assessment in Vermont, there are things that we need to do. I sent out also, which we can discuss, a straw man, which is just the beginnings of a policy statement for the board. And based on the emails I've received, we should have a very interesting kind of discussion on that. But first, for very short, no more than 5 minutes or so, we'll have overviews of these 4 pieces. And Sean Marie, you've got the first one, appropriate.
And I had one of the shortest articles. So one of well, all I'd like to say is that the bullets contained in the article, which was appropriate use of high-stakes testing in our nation's schools. You all have it. I don't know if I can sum up the bullets, but I will say that the takeaway is tests should be part of a system in which broad-based, equitable access to education and opportunity advancement is provided to all students, and tests, when used properly, are among the most sound and
Wait, Sean Marie,
efficient.
you have to wait till that goes by.
I figured I probably would. The tests are not they're not valid for all purposes, and they're basically not, they have to be used in a more broad view, so that no test is valid for all purposes. And I think it's from the American Psychological Association. They also talk about knowing if and what students are learning is very important, and that school officials using tests must ensure that students are tested on a curriculum that they've had a fair opportunity to learn. And to me, that was a really big takeaway. And then the overview on the appropriate use of tests, I think you all read. You really don't want me to read the bullets out loud, do you? No. Lachlan's saying no. Bill?
Were you asking me or what?
I'm asking you if you'd like me to read basically the 5 bullets that they are.
I still didn't get that.
Do you want her to read all of these? I think we've all read them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's enough for anyone that's watching to know that this particular article from the American Psychological Association is giving both the pros and cons for why tests are appropriate in some settings, but one test cannot do it all, and that it's important for the test to measure what the student is supposed to have learned.
And one example that I would look at is the kneecaps are, I don't know what Smarter Balance is going to look like just yet, but it can give us a score, but it doesn't have the power to give you the diagnostics. And if you have a diagnostic test, maybe it's not appropriate for group administration, or it's not appropriate for aggregation of the score. And this is going to be a big problem, and people are pushing with SBAC the use of diagnostic and growth models, and I'm not so sure that you can do that.
One of the things we know about the Smarter Balance assessment is it's still a grade level test. It's not completely open, so it will assess students who are about 2 years below and 2 years above. But if a student is substantially below grade level or substantially above grade level, we'll have very little data about what they can do, and it wouldn't be useful at all for growth models.
Can we hold the discussion just for a moment?
Just read another sentence from this, which I think is appropriate to a sort of a statewide issue, which is the potential problem with the current increased emphasis on testing is not necessarily the test per se, but the instances when tests have been unintended and potentially negative consequences on individual students, groups of students, or the educational system more broadly. And, but this is also critical to remember that in many instances without tests, low-performing students in schools could remain invisible. So I think for me, in reading this, is that, you know, the current testing system is measuring the system, and I'm not sure how it's helping the students. I mean,
There you go. Krista, you had a remark?
Actually, it was going to be that paragraph exactly, but just the last part that you didn't read, that idea that these tests the most appropriate way is to see where maybe extra resources or remedial help is needed.
Right.
And that's appropriate, not to the punish piece. So the school's not doing well, so we're going to punish you. Maybe this test doesn't go well, maybe we need to give you extra support and extra help. And to me, that was the biggest takeaway.
Other comments on
The only point I didn't see in here, and we've heard from students on this board, is the relevance of the test to the student individually when it doesn't count towards their grade. So the attention and the devotion they give to the test really questions the accuracy of the results.
I mean, yeah, I actually struggled this year with whether or not to take kneecap tests because I knew that it didn't affect me and I already didn't really believe in them, but then was pressured by teachers and administrators by being like, well, we're such a small school, if you don't take it, that could bring down our score, and what's that, and are you ready to have those consequences that could come if we fail a third year? And it just, and then I did decide this second semester to opt out and not take it because I realized that I have consistently done it twice a year, every year, for a lot of years. And I felt like I was done sacrificing for what I truly believed in to just help the school. And like, I didn't understand how much I was really helping. Does my score really count and improve it that much? And I felt like if I was to take it, I, of course, would do well and score well, but I would rather have done what I did, which was not take it, use the time when everybody was testing to catch up on my back work that I had gotten behind in because I was at internships and meetings and conferences, and so was able to do well in my classes that actually reflect my learning and affect me in the future, and do something that I cared about.
I don't know how widespread that is, Bill, but it's, you know, I think it must be an issue in the accuracy and the
I think
dependency.
it raises real issues. I haven't really seen a lot of research on that. That doesn't mean it exists, but you can get fierce discussions about this, and how it distorts what we're getting.
Well, other schools now are offering incentives to students. So if they pass, I know one school, they went to the Peak Water Park, if they made AYP, and they did, and that was, so there are other incentives to get the students. So now schools are trying to get creative. They'll excuse them from various finals if they can pass proficiency. I know that came up in my school, that one girl didn't pass by 1 point, and she had to take a final when other people didn't have to because she didn't pass. So I think schools, because that's what's hard to measure this data, schools have different incentives too they're offering
So
students.
that, to me, that would prove the validity of my point that it probably has some effect if schools are going to that extreme.
I think what's interesting is actually how much we've invested in the test, which is just an indicator. It's like checking your oil. You know, you stick it in, you say, oh, I'm low, I need to add some more oil, or I need to add some more resources to this district to support better outcomes. But what we've done is we've invested so much energy into the test itself, which is just an indicator.
And that goes into what the next article's about too.
Right.
Okay, Krista?
Okay, I mean, that was a good segue, in trying to invest into the different areas. But this one is from Incentives and Test-Based Accountability in Education. It's put together by National Academy of Sciences, of National Academy of Engineering, and Institute of Medicine, and the National Research Council. And this was part of a longer piece, so it was just a couple of pages. But I think going to that, looking at what's being tested is very narrow. And if we're looking at reading and math, it's not really a measure of all desired outcomes. It goes on to talk about there's nothing really about characteristics of learning, and if we all think that's so important, but there really is, that you need characteristics of creativity, curiosity, persistence, values, collaboration, and socialization, but you get none of that from this type of assessment, and you really can't judge that. That there really is kind of what we expect out of schools and what we get from these tests really don't match. And then ideally each performance task would be linked to just one task you're trying to learn, but a lot of times there are multiple things being tested or inadvertently being tested. And then also the idea that what you see this distortion happening, that really when you're focusing just on that test and then you then are kind of pushing aside maybe some of the other things that would actually have a better outcome in the long run. So for that short-term goal of a test, and you boost those scores by those test-taking strategies, and you are then just really focusing on the test, it's not really the process, and then the outcomes are not really the desired that you would like. That was just a overall.
Okay,
Does anyone like anything about testing?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm so surprised it's you, but I'm thrilled to hear it.
You need different information for different audiences. What you're looking at the state level might be different from what you're looking at the school level and it's an individual level. So you need different kinds of measures of performance, and some of it, there may be a standardized test that does something for one level that, but it's just one tiny piece. And I think the situation we're in is that tiny piece, the testing culture that we're currently in, has overwhelmed other measures that are valid. So we're not seeing that information, and until we elevate some of that up and provide more comparable data, things like your approval process that you just described with the education quality standards, that kind of thing, it's going to remain distorted.
I did note in the first piece from the American Psychological Association, I hadn't thought of this before, that it's critical to remember that in many instances without tests, low-performing students or schools would remain invisible. But I would certainly think there's probably other ways that educational regulators could determine that without tests.
Mark?
Yeah, I think school board members like to see some form of testing because it helps to validate why they approve budgets to go in front of voters. I know I, for one, I don't know, about 17 years of being on school boards, I've always been very frustrated having test results given to me because we're never, on one hand, we know it's just one piece of the puzzle, but it's about putting all the pieces of the puzzles together. And I think that probably the most frustrating thing of being a school board member is understanding when a superintendent a school, a system is actually working. But certainly tests help you put that together. And I think as school board members, we also look at it different. And some rely on that information greater than others. And from my perspective, I think you can always pull out the tests, and you're always given sort of the highlights, and we don't talk so much about the areas of improvement. I mean, it always comes up, but it feels like because the press is there, the cameras are running, that it's a dog and pony show to a certain extent, where the administration has to put the best spin on whatever information they have.
Lachlan, Stacy, and then Krista.
Well, I think in response to Rebecca's question about whether any of us like testing, so when I was...
I had to like taking them.
Well, yeah, different than like taking them out. Testing is just general educational policy. So when I was in kindergarten, No Child Left Behind was signed. So it's kind of dominated my whole, educational career, I suppose. I lived in 2 different states. I, did kindergarten, first grade here in Vermont, and then I did 2 or 3 years in Massachusetts and then back to Vermont. They handle it in very different ways. In second grade in Massachusetts, they come along and sell you SAT prep in second grade. And you take...
You said sell, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. And then in third grade, you take the Terra Nova, you take the MCAS, and there's one other test you take. So you're taking tons of exams. I was just reading on, actually from the NEA, President Randy Weingarten talking about, I think it was Wisconsin, they were taking like 4 tests a year or something. So I think Vermont already does a pretty good job of regular standardizing tests. And there is a role to play of standardized tests as formative assessment. But I think what most of these articles touch on is concerning is when standardized testing leaves the realm of formative assessment. There are lots of dangers, and whether that's as cut scores or as using it to assess schools or teachers, it's dangerous. And I think it's a positive tool for teachers, because if it's September 5th and you've had a kid for all of a week, and you're able to see, well, did this student score proficient or below proficient, and it's a reliable test, which is another thing we have to get to, then you can say, okay, well then there's, so it makes that process a little bit easier, and I've heard that from teachers here. But, until we find a way to remove the stigmas of failing schools and all that stuff, it hurts.
So what I think I'm hearing is that we think tests are useful for, sort of taking a measure of where we are, but what we don't like is the consequential uses, using it to sanction, punish, or label.
And it shouldn't be the only measure.
Right.
And it needs to be
Correct.
one
Absolutely.
of multiple
It's
measures.
part
One
of,
of
part of
multiple
multiple measures, yeah.
Stacy?
Yeah, I guess I totally agree with what Rebecca just said. I think I was surprised to learn recently that Burlington School District, the teacher said to me kind of offhandedly, but my daughter said, well, we don't test past level M in reading in second grade. And I thought about that later. I said, what does that mean you don't test past level M? And because whatever the assumption is that that's beginning of third grade reading. And so since the child's in second grade, you don't assess past a certain point. And I understand in terms of capacity where a teacher might run out. But I think then if we're bothering to do the tests, then I think you should do all the tests for all the kids to figure out for exactly the reason Lachlan said, because that child will go into another classroom on September 5th. And it'd be helpful to know not just what are they above or below some mark, but like, well, where, if we're talking about individualized learning, then let's go ahead and get individual measures on all the kids wherever they're at, not just stop because they've passed some threshold, which, as we noted in the articles, those scores, can be valid or not. So I think that concerned me, and I was kind of surprised to discover that.
That's concerning as a policy, because as a teacher, you would want to know if they were PQ, R, or S, so you would know about choosing what reading material was appropriate for them
And in
while it was
fact-
still in second grade.
Right.
So that is teaching to a curriculum and to, that's not teaching kids, and we're about teaching
And in
kids.
fact, that teacher said, I'm gonna go ahead and assess them anyway, because I want to tell you, the parent, what sort of books you should be choosing for her over the summer. And I thought, gosh, how much of summer lag might we be able to address if we could give parents more, not all parents, but at least some families might really be able to take advantage of that information. Yeah. So.
I guess what I was going to say, I mean, I was going to agree with Margaret a couple, she talked about just that these tests are really good for individual students. I really don't think they're perfect for systems, and that's what I think we're all touching on, that just because individuals take this test, it helps me as a teacher to see where they are. But I don't like looking at the results for the first week of because I want to know who the kids are. Like, I don't want to see what this test result, because that one day they went in and took their GATES test last, spring. I just took the GATES with my students a couple of weeks ago, and then their 10th grade teachers are going to get those results. What if somebody came in and had a really bad day, or they didn't feel like doing the test, or, so I don't like judging just on that one assessment, and that's where I think it's dangerous to use these one score, one reading test as this one child, this is their ability, this is exactly where they're at. I think that's dangerous, and that's why, as a teacher, I use it, but then I use it with a grain of salt. Like, okay, this is where they were on that day in June. Let's figure out where they are today and move forward. And that's why I just want to reiterate that systems piece. And then, Lachlan, you picked up on this idea of these are formative, but we've been using them as summative,
Right,
end all, be all. And if it's really a summative, you should have multiple attempts. But we don't have multiple attempts. So if you take the kneecaps and you don't show that you're proficient, you don't see it again until next time you take it. We don't have another try, and that's one of the downfalls of some of these tests too, the multiple attempts.
I need a political lesson. I mean, why is this issue still so difficult?
For the reason you just discussed, which is that before we tested students, we ignored whole subgroups of students who were not adequately served, and still aren't. Frankly, we wouldn't know that we weren't serving particularly our low-income, our boys who are living in poverty disproportionately compared to others.
I think also in terms of, it became a political solution that we're going to do Nickelby tests are going to reform, and here we are at 2014, and Lachlan spent his whole school career under this law.
Let me assure you, it has not held him back, though.
He's done quite well in spite of these difficulties.
Wasted some time.
But
Quite a lot.
it hasn't closed the achievement gap. Everybody didn't become proficient in 2014 as the law promised. And this is the big thing that comes out of this paper is test-based reforms, which is no child left behind with more tests and more penalties. Well, guess what? The achievement gap is just as big as it was when it started. It hasn't done that. And when this article here says 0.08 standard deviations improvement for math in the elementary schools, well, that's not much. And if you talk about having an effect on high schools or having an effect on reading, it really hasn't done that. And so it's like, politically, we bought into a system, put it into federal law, and it just simply hasn't worked, and it shows no promise of working, yet we're saddled with it, and we're spending all this time and money doing testing, making everybody mad and angry, and it's not paying off.
Well, I understand why it was probably instituted in 2001, and I'm still on the political part here, but, and Rebecca makes a great point, and I understand that. But I just don't understand politically, with the change in governmental control, why there hasn't been more flexibility, more change here. I don't know if it's relevant to this conversation, but
It
I'm just
is
struck by
relevant,
that.
and we were having, part of this discussion at lunch is that who we get as Secretary of Education made a difference. Arnie Duncan stayed there, and he bought into these policies. If Linda Darling Hammond was the Secretary of Education, the whole world would have been different. And by then, we have a huge paralysis in Congress anyway. And some of the private school, charter school operators want to show public schools as failing. And we have a testing system with cutoff points to guarantee failure. And so there's a political advantage for people who are really saying less role for public education, less role for public governance.
The bill passed with like a bipartisan coalition of stupidity, and then we've been like slowly chipping away at it.
Careful, it's one of your own people
And that
voted
was
for it.
my section, because you assigned me number 4, Bill, cut scores, and I read your piece, and then I read the piece Rebecca, that Krista sent, but Rebecca, I couldn't, when I went to his website, the link didn't work for for the one you sent, and when I
Andrew
went to
Hose?
his website, you couldn't read, is it Jonathan Yao? It was, you couldn't download them to read, they were in 3 formats that I couldn't read
Oh,
on my
I'm sorry.
Mac. So I
Okay.
never got
I can
that.
I can pull them for
But
you.
I summarized and sent you a summary yesterday or the day before, the weekend, of my reading about the cut scores. My question, and it's one for you, Rebecca, in that, right now at a state level, we have the test scores. You're talking about other data in terms of quality that we will have. But in terms of student assessment data, Act 77 leveraged to a systems level innovations that were going on in some schools, but not all schools, and it was recognized that these are good practices, all schools should do them. And so that's why we're all doing personal learning plans in multiple pathways. We used to have portfolios at a systems level that were a bit more balanced, as opposed to, we didn't just have test scores, we had test scores and portfolios. So what should we have at a systems level around performance assessment to tip the scale a little bit? Because right now we have, many schools and many different practices, and some schools do a very good job of putting the test scores in context, and other schools don't have as wide a range of data to do that. So can the system do something about that?
I think the emphasis on the performance tasks of proficiency, that's intended to do that. It's supposed to hit some of the same kind, what's going to hit the, we're starting with the 21st century skills, the transferable skills.
Right.
But it's supposed to demonstrate learning and give students an opportunity to demonstrate their strengths in arenas that aren't sampled by the standardized test. And the purpose in having the scoring supported by the work out of the Center of Assessment and David Roof's group is that it allows us to do so in a more calibrated way. The problem with the portfolios is I think they were an incredibly powerful tool internally for professional development, but we didn't get a sense, there was a lot of drift or error. We didn't know that the standards in School A were the same as School B. And so the problem was there were pockets where we systematically overlooked or didn't challenge certain students. And historically, we haven't challenged students of color, we haven't challenged students from living in poverty sufficiently or provided them with sufficient opportunities to do well. And so the purpose of having the public scoring supported by a website is to allow teachers to calibrate their internal assessment of performance tasks with the state samples.
So this will be on a statewide level, or is it on a choice?
The intent is to do it on a statewide level.
Not a choice level of thing. And it's at certain grade levels? It's in certain, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the timeline?
I think it's partly dependent on funding, which is why I showed you the funding.
Yeah, okay.
I wouldn't expect it to be operational before 5 years. I mean, it's just reality, fully calibrate, because as soon as you phase in, I mean, I think we have to be realistic. We are asking, I'm gonna just speak realistically for a minute. We are asking our teachers to fly the airplane where they retool it already with Common Core. And if you embrace the challenge of the Common Core, it's not just a new curriculum. They're implicit in it changes about how you teach. And that is requiring our teachers to take tremendous risks and to really push some changes in their practice. And so we have to be mindful of that and the burdens we place on them as they do that. And then make sure that whatever assessment system we're setting up isn't intrusive, but it's really capturing the outcome of that work as well. Because we expect whatever work they're doing there in terms of shifts is going to manifest itself also in this arena.
I just think going on, just to kind of reinforce that, as we're teaching right now and changing to Common Core, and we have 5 professional days, and that's when we're supposed to change our whole curriculum, and the realistic of that. So as myself, I was asked to make a unit that was a purely Common Core unit and present it in June, and then a month ago that got changed to, well, now you're not going to have June to work on that. It has to be done by June, and you have to say what proficiencies are in there, even though we don't have proficiencies. So when all these initiatives are coming through, it's trying to get jam-packed into 5 professional days. And so when we want change like this to happen, I think it brings up that bigger topic of teacher training and professional development, and maybe at a policy level, is 5 days enough to change all of this teaching while you're teaching? And I keep hearing, well, we'll have teachers go to this and we'll have teachers go to that. But when's the time? And it's an investment. And I think that's maybe a bigger policy question that we could talk about in June at our retreat, is when we really look at time on learning and time for professional development, what's appropriate. But
And my sense is that, given the standards, many teachers can understand them. I think the hard part is figuring out how you teach and in creating time and space for that as well. Going back to Bill's point earlier, I think one of the challenges of test-based accountability is that we are diverting increasing resources into the test preparation materials and the curriculum materials, all of which are generated by the same publisher often, in diverting it out of professional development and out of support for improvement instructions.
I don't think we have a clue as to, nor the resources to even seriously begin to dent the Common Core curriculum implementation. It's just not there. I don't see it. The state doesn't have the capacity. The local districts with 5 in-service days don't have the capacity. And we'll see how the test goes in terms of what it shows, but it's set up as almost a guaranteed failure system.
But the good news is that, unlike other states, we haven't tied evaluation of our teachers and our principals to the tests, and that's good news. And I think what I would worry about is that quality means sustaining attention and being purposeful about improvement over time. And it's not a coincidence that schools make more progress when they have consistency of leadership, for example. You have to be in there for the long haul, and we have to have that long-term horizon. And the other thing we're doing is we're going to try to make sure that we have a group of legislators and newspaper reporters take the Common Core, hopefully at Montpelier High School, side by side. We'll have to guarantee that we won't get individual scores, I'm sure. But I think if we compare the mean score of legislators and reporters to the mean score of the sophomores or the juniors at Montpelier, my guess is it will help put in perspective some of the cut scores we see.
Rebecca,
Bill, excuse me.
Just one quick question. Are we collecting independent feedback on the schools who have done the pilot for SBAC, or is the SBAC collecting that?
SBAC is collecting it, and the data is not actually we're not getting individual scores for kids,
Right.
because they're field testing the items to scale a test, you have to do a series of analyses of individual items. And so what they're doing is basically using the field test to just test the test.
So are we, as a state, asking schools for their feedback on that experience?
Yes,
Yes.
they're already giving it to, and we will actually, several districts have spoken to us, and we're going to ask them about this, but the SBAC sent out something like a 40-page guide on administration, and the schools have asked us to distill it into 4 pages, basically, something that's comprehensible, and we'll do that for schools in advance of the test. And I think the key thing, and when you look at any implementation of a new assessment, what you tend to see is the first year is a disaster. People sort of figure out the test, and then you see some pretty rapid gains. And then once that easy fruit has been picked, they tend to level off a bit. And that's about familiarity with the test. And I think we should expect that in the Vermont data. And we should be intentional about what we can use the test for in terms of supporting continuous improvement, but also very realistic and moderate about what we think it can and can't tell us, is my advice.
In the interest, excuse me,
Yep, go ahead.
in the interest of time, your straw man,
Yeah.
can you explain at the beginning what your thought is here?
Okay.
I don't mean to cut off the conversation on those 3 articles, but it's pretty clear that we've got some pretty general agreement on it. And it's, to my surprise, pretty clear everybody read all 3 articles.
Well, good discussion, good input, good content. I'm really pleased. The straw man is the beginning of a state board position paper or a policy statement on large-scale assessment. And considering that we have 3 minutes according to the schedule
Well,
in
you
order
can
to
take a little longer
process
than
that,
You're allowed to have 4.
let me ask you to look over it and give me your input as to what we need to do, and we probably need to come back to this next meeting with a different draft. And so I think at this point is gathering input would be the most useful thing to do.
Would this be an ingredient in our strategic plan and/or priorities for the next year?
I would certainly think so. It would certainly fit with what I would like to see. Other people will have to speak for themselves.
Bill, was your intention that this was something that could be, under federal law, we're still required to make AYP determinations? Was your intent that a policy statement could be sent to all schools to be distributed with the scores?
I think that was exactly what I said.
That would be great, okay, just asking.
Yes, it should be sent to the schools in the state, and it will have some implications which are sensitive and need to be thought about in terms of your interactions with the federal government, because there's some things here that they might not like, even though we're right.
Well, should we go to those?
Well, we can, let's start at the top and see what is controversial. Does anybody have any questions about number 1, the purpose?
I know some people are seeing it for the first time, so can you?
If you got some word changes, I'll take those.
Well, and if people are just seeing it for the first time, I mean, this is obvious,
He sent it to us electronically, so we've had it a few days.
right, Margaret? But not everyone had an opportunity to read it.
Wonder who.
My email just changed, maybe I missed it, so.
Well,
Let's do this way. Let's not take any final action on this. Let's put this into our discussion at the retreat. But Margaret, if you have some comments that you'd like to
I'll
make to
send them
Bill,
to Bill.
that would, no, go ahead.
no, let's see
have
if
them.
we have a consensus of opinion on some of these matters.
Although some members have not had a chance to read or study this, so,
We're just talking. We'll come back to this at the retreat.
okay.
I have a concern about number 2B, where you say that testing shall be conducted in at least 1 grade level, but no more than 2 grade levels in each school. Because under federal policy, we're required to test in every grade 3 through 8, and we jeopardize our federal funding, and people should be aware of that. So
Well,
if this was written as an advisory, that we think that good policy would involve this, that would be fine. The reality is, until the state is willing to forego federal funding, it should expect to test in every mandated grade.
would people agree that I would, if I rephrased this and said good policy would be to test no more than 2 grades,
But because due to federal mandate.
and we could say due to federal mandate, we could put that in.
I mean, if you're acknowledging, I mean, as a state, like, we would love to see this happen, but because we're bound by federal policy, we can't. But if we did, this is what we'd like.
I can put that in. What's people's pleasure?
I want to actually comment too that on B, you don't say standardized testing, you just start with testing.
Yeah.
And I think you're differentiating, at least that's the impression I'm
Yeah.
getting, we're differentiating between standardized tests and
That's
that
right.
form of assessment,
That's a good
Got
point.
it.
right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So what you're saying here, B, is it just says testing.
So you
I
need
mean,
to, you need to add standardized?
Word standardized.
Well, if the statement is referring to standardized, then yes. If it's referring to assessments, which I don't think that's what you mean,
No.
then you need to.
Time for your comment that you'd shared with me about
Me?
different grades and different different kinds of
Right,
presentation.
because the headline is large-scale assessment, and I think that setting the big picture of the variety of assessments and how we need assessments that show continuous growth, and we need a wide range of material that gives us indications of growth, and that standardized testing is one piece of a bigger balanced system of assessment, and this one piece shouldn't be out of proportion with everything else, but also should be at specific grade levels. In this case, Rebecca, you said because of No Child Left Behind, and this is where I get a little wonder, because I know New Hampshire has this option 2 in development, whereas, and it may be because they're a waiver state, but schools in New Hampshire are actually signing up right now for option 2, and if they sign up for option 2, they only have to do the SBAC at 2 grade levels. They have to show they're doing other kinds of assessment at other grade levels, but it doesn't have to be the SBAC. So they're using the SAT, or they're using performance assessment and the National Test Bank They're assessing, they're just not using the standardized test. And in New Hampshire, a district can make that choice starting next year.
That's because they're a
Because
waiver
they're a
state.
waiver state. So has the case been made for Vermont as a non-waiver state to also do that?
That's what my whole call was last week with Secretary, Deputy Secretary.
And he said,
Gillette.
later, keep pushing back on that.
Until we are willing to, evaluation of teachers and principals to be based on test scores, no.
Sure,
Is
has it
going to
made that
be-
commitment?
They have made
Okay.
that commitment.
Okay.
They are committed to
Okay.
evaluating their teachers and principals in part on test scores.
But if they're not using just standardized test scores, if they're using a range of assessments to do that, it might be a little bit more acceptable than.
And there's two issues there, and part of it is depends how well your other assessments differentiate.
Right,
So for
right.
example, there was a study out of, I think it was Indiana or something, and they were talking about how, I think 90-something% of teachers were proficient or, qualified. The other measures don't differentiate, which means the differentiation is based on the standardized test score.
I mean, I'm not a fan of assessing teachers through test scores at all, but I do like the flexibility that districts in New Hampshire are being given to present a broader picture of assessment that has standardized tests in its place.
Okay, how about I do something like the following, add a C under 4, which would wrap together this notion of comprehensive assessments, which would play directly off what Rebecca was just talking about before, and say that this is really our primo accountability model, meaning this system rather than the narrow test-based.
Right.
Just add a whole new point addressing that. Does that work? I see some nods.
And we'll have to get cracking on things like the survey to get some of those other tools out fast.
Yep.
Okay, other comments or questions on the thing?
Could you clarify, similarly on 6, we're required to report under federal law, student performance in terms of the proficiency-based determinations. Is your intent just a critique of that, or are you saying that we should not report? I mean, our intention is to think moving forward about modifying the score reports to report that, but bury it and focus our attention on scale scores, which is you describe here a more appropriate way to describe performance.
How about I change that to say that we will do compliance mode B with the federal government, and it will not be the direction of our system that we would arrange publicly. Which raises another question for me, Rebecca. Just because we have this comprehensive system of multiple indicators, what would keep the media from going straight for the test scores and doing a rank order of schools?
Well, I think it'll be interesting when some of them take the test. If they take the test, then they would have to go after their own performance on the Smarter Balanced in the spring next year.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a challenging test from what we've heard. I think it is not, I mean, I still have yet to go to a public forum where anyone can tell me what Cavalieri's principle is. And that's a 10th grade math standard. And in speaking with hundreds of people, I've yet to have anyone be able to answer that question.
So should we take it as a board?
Oh, I was gonna suggest Stephen takes it.
No, I mean, shouldn't we as a board take the SBAC? I mean, that's what you're looking for. How do we have this role in getting this word out? And
Well, as chair, I rarely vote, so I guess if you all want to take the test, you could, and,
Stephen should take it. Yeah.
That brings us right back to
Save that
proficiency.
for August, too.
It brings us right back to what is proficiency.
Right, it does.
And the cut scores.
And that's, no one can answer that.
you know,
I
looking.
think the issue, though, is how do we have a strength-based, when you think about the EQS, what it was focusing on was a strength-based approach. And the advantage of a proficiency model is it's not focused on whether or not you measure up, it's focused on what you can do and what the next level of work is for you, if you pitch it that way.
So proficiency at your level.
Where are you in this trajectory? And this is the goal. Some kids will go beyond it, but what is it that we expect? And it's a way to hold ourselves accountable for ensuring that all students are given robust opportunities, and also acknowledges.
How do you explain that to somebody that's not in education jargon when you say that they're proficient at their level and we're expecting them to.
Well, that's.
That's a good question, and I think that's why this is so challenging. I would also argue, I mean, let me give you another anecdote. I was up in the North Country Career and Technical Center, and I met a student who was using a 3D printer to design some components for a device he was building. And he was using incredibly sophisticated trigonometry to do that. And he said he learned more math in that context than he ever learned in a math class in school. And part of it is the realization that different kids learn differently, and they also demonstrate skill and strength differently. And so it's just a different way of demonstrating what you're capable of doing.
I wonder, and maybe it's too early, but maybe it's more for the, if this goes into our strategic plan, but if there was a lead paragraph here explaining, you know, what the federal government is demanding and Vermont's general response to that, and you know, some comment on proficiency-based, and I mean, so if someone else picks up this document who doesn't deal with this stuff on a day-to-day basis, I think it might be better understood.
Yeah, okay.
Bill, maybe also something like the parent, a friendly piece, you know, the principals have to send that shaming letter, we failed to
Yes.
make AYP. If a version of this went along with that letter, I think that would be very supportive and helpful for parents who then.
Oh, that's a nice idea.
So, okay. So you'll do another draft of this, which we'll get a chance to review before the June
I
meeting?
will email it out before the June meeting, but if we could put it on the agenda and put it in the public documents.
Anything else that anyone wants to comment on this? Well done, Bill. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Carol, do we want to be in open session? Do we need to be in open session to talk about the June retreat and these various things, or? If we were in? Okay, all right, why don't you, Carol sent us a couple of things, and I really marveled at the work she did. And let me do the easy one first. Around the June meeting, we usually do a board review that you maybe all have been involved in the past. Carol has gone through the normal review that we've used in the past and updated it, and now that we're now that the role of the board is somewhat different. So the first, are you just seeing this for the first time?
Yes.
They are, okay. So I think this is too much to go through.
It is, so I think reading and commenting.
Yeah, I think if you got back to Carol with any thoughts that you had on these revisions, that would be very helpful. And I would ask you to do that rather soon, because my hope would be that we could get the finalized copy out to all board members, get you to compile it, probably electronically. We've usually had one board member.
That would be Bonnie.
Yeah, well.
She's not here, so.
Well, but
You can
Bonnie,
really sign it.
but Bonnie's got another assignment. She's with the meeting coming up, so I'm.
Rules and decisions, which is not here now, right? Isn't that what you do?
Any volunteers?
But she did it on SurveyMonkey.
All right, well, I'll check with her, but, you know, Bonnie also has a role in the strategic plan, so that's,
The advantage of doing it possibly in-house is that if we can do it in one place, you can keep the survey for next year as well.
That's, I think
Okay.
she might have it already.
Okay.
She's on her
It should be
Google
collected, you
Docs.
want to use the same collector over time.
okay. I will check with
It just
Bonnie.
saves time.
But I guess, in that we don't know, I guess I would get back to Carol with any suggestions or comments that you have, and ask you to do that by end of the week if you possibly could.
Stephen, can I address the June meeting for a minute?
Sure.
I held the June meeting dates, all year, and when I arranged my schedule around them. So I'm going to be in Arkansas the week after the June meeting dates were scheduled. And when there was potential conflicts with the June meeting dates, I did let Carol know that the following week I would not be available. I think it's unfortunate that I'm not able to attend the retreat. I think the retreat was really helpful last year, and I think I was able to make a positive contribution in terms of the priorities document. So I'm disappointed that it wasn't able to be worked out so I could be at the retreat.
Because we will be celebrating not only Lachlan, but we'll be celebrating Carol's departure too.
We're not celebrating that.
Well, isn't that the way you put it? Well, I don't, no, celebrating the contribution that they've made to
There you
the, okay. No, I didn't mean to celebrate that we're getting rid of it, no.
You might be.
So, and I don't know how, I'm going to leave it up to you who else should be included and involved in that and making the dinner reservation.
Okay.
Okay?
Something really good, Carol. Something really good.
Okay.
And I don't know how we're going to, I mean, the finances, we'll get into that later, I guess. All right,
Stay
so,
in the dorm with me at UVM.
No.
Save some money. That's where I'm going to
Stay
be.
at my house.
I spent all the nights I ever need to spend in a dorm.
Thank you.
You very much,
You can chaperone with me.
No.
especially UVM. So the two big issues that we're going to be dealing with, aside from our regular meeting, go ahead.
I'm gonna have to run out.
Is, you know, our strategic plan, and I gather the committee has not met very often, so I'm not sure where we are on that. Who actually serves with Bonnie on the strategic planning committee?
Over here.
I've attended one meeting. It was the meeting we held at Rochester School. It was for a part of the meeting, and we weren't all there. There hasn't been any communication about other potential meetings.
So it's Margaret, Bonnie, Stacy, and Bill. And Stacy and Bill were both on very busy other
Right,
committees.
on the legislative committee.
Yeah, so Bonnie and I met in Rochester, but there hasn't been any communication about convening any other meetings before or after board meetings or other times.
All right, well, I guess I'm going to contact Bonnie and see how she intends to fulfill this, and maybe it's not going to get done at the June meeting. I don't know. But I was also hoping that that conversation would lead to at least a draft of our priorities for the next year. And you'll see Carol has prepared a chart of where she thinks we are with with our 5 priorities.
And the next steps column on that document are suggestions from Rebecca as to steps that the board might consider taking.
So I would, let me ask you this, I would think this would at least serve as a document to have a full board discussion on what our priorities would be for the next year.
At that time, would we be looking at new priorities and
As well,
revisions?
yes. We may very well go over these and find out, I'm just going to pick a number, exit, and then goal number 3, we just have not fully completed yet, so that remains. Or we may say exit. Goal 3 was a mistake, and we're going to forget it, but we ought to come up with at least five goals for the next year, and I would suspect that one proposal might be going back to the consolidation and governance structure that maybe not everyone will agree with. Okay?
So again, if you have any comments or any updates on this document, because this really is work that you have done, or you perceive that you have done.
Updates over the past year.
The past year, yeah.
Okay.
So,
Which, in your wildest
Diplomatic.
imagination, you may have thought you had done.
That's a nice gentle little.
so I'm known for my gentleness.
So I think that's all we need to cover?
I think, yeah. I will have an updated version of the actual strategic plan. I just didn't have time yesterday to get that together. I'll also send that to you, just so you'll know where you are with that over the last 4 or 5 years.
Thank you.
So, you know, that would be another piece that I would think that you would want to look at and do a little evaluation on
Can you
before
check
you
on the,
embark
anyway, quick way to check on
the next discussion.
I also, for just the minutes in the record, want to approve or recognize the financial report that Bill sent, which I am not finding very quickly.
There you go.
So let the minutes show that we received a financial statement as of April 30th, showing that we had spent about 93% of our budgeted expenses for the year.
Turn it over, I think you might be at 90%.
At what?
Make sure that the date
At
is,
90%, yes. What am I looking at over here?
that's last year.
Oh. So we're ahead of, so we're 3 percentage points ahead of last year at this juncture. So we'll just have the minutes reflect that. I don't think we need a motion on that. Any other business to come before the monthly board meeting? If not, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say no.
Oh, the day.
Okay.